Okay. I'm still trying to figure out my setup and all my gear and everything. Can you guys hear me? How's it sounding? I have to have the AC on because it's summer, and so it will get way too hot in here if I don't have the AC machine on. So I'm sorry about the noise. We're just gonna do our best with it. You guys have to tell me if it's too overpowering though, and I can turn it off and then, I don't know, maybe take a break. Turn it back on. I don't know how we're gonna manage that, but this is what we gotta do. You can tell. Very professional operation we have going here. Yay! Megan can hear. Melanie can hear. Hey guys, I'm glad you could be here. And Max is gonna be in and out too. Okay, cool. This is gonna be a lot of fun. I am very excited about what we're gonna talk about today. I've had a lot of fun pulling this together, thinking about it, all that sort of stuff. Okay, sounds good? Yay. Yay. I'm just checking all my things. It's a little bit more complex than last time, but that's how I roll usually. It's like, can't just do it simply. We just can't. How are you guys? How is it going? Anybody working on any fun projects lately? Anybody watching, reading anything interesting? I've been watching stuff for this and reading stuff for this, talking about Antagonists, but I'm working on a short film. And if anyone, Megan, I think, is the only one here who's really been hanging out with me early in the morning. I wrote a short film script a few weeks back, and now I'm moving forward into getting ready for pre-production, so pulling a crew together, finding kind of my key factors and pulling that together. So that'll be pretty fun. I'll be shooting that in the next couple months, and I've been working on development for a feature and a couple other long-term projects, I guess you could call them. But that's been what's been up with me. A lot of research, a lot of development. I don't feel like over the past year I've had much to show for all the work that I'm putting in, because I'm still putting the investment and the work in to develop a lot of different projects. So I'm excited that I'm getting to the season where it's like, okay, I can finally start talking about these things and start showing people some of what we're working on, and it's fun to reach that season. What's my short about? It is a drama, and it's I can read you the log line because I have it. When a young woman comes seeking revenge on his estranged father, Peter is forced to confront and reconcile with the secrets and the need for forgiveness in his life. I think I need to work on some of my grammar on that one. That was a draft. I think there was too many subjects going on in the same sentence. But basically, yes, Peter is the main character, and he's estranged from his father, and it's kind of an intense Godfather-ish type story where he has to kind of deal with that and deal with the secrets of his past and all that sort of fun stuff. Very dramatic. You're in the middle of reading How to Edit a Book and Building Character Arcs, K.M. Weiland. As far as projects, you've slowed down on CTF films at the moment, and you're majorly focusing on the book. Sorry guys, I have allergies, so we're gonna have issues with that. Well, that's pretty cool. Are those books helping you, Megan? The How to Edit a Book and Building Character Arcs? How to edit a book sounds interesting. I'm thinking that might need to be kind of my next major avenue of research, is getting good at editing, at content editing, but also at line editing and all the intricacies of grammar. It's I know the basics of grammar, but there's always okay, but what about this weird situation where you're quoting a thing that's a reference to, it's all this weird punctuation and grammar sort of stuff that you got to figure out, and I just don't have the training in that. Part of your process for developing story ideas is sketching people and places. Oh, cool. So that's what you've been up to. Casting the narrative, as it were. That's cool. That's a really cool idea. I like that because you have to stop and pay attention, right? And so you start putting your mental energy into creating the stories and the intricacies of the characters. That's really cool. I like that. I probably should get started here in a couple minutes. I guess I should start with, for anyone who is new to the channel and who happens to stop in, hello, my name is Annie Pulling Sweat, and I am a completely self-taught screenwriter and director. I've been directing films for over 10 years now. I started when I was 14 and 15 years old, and just have done a lot of short films, and a couple years back I got to write and direct my first feature film, and now I'm working on writing my next feature film, which I am going to be directing as well. You're not late, we're just chatting. I like to give a little bit of wiggle room here at the beginning and give people a chance to find it. Been trying to write more, daily struggle, but excited about your passion project. Oh, cool. Well, I'm glad you're like engaging and getting to write more. It's been a lot of fun for me. Doing the early morning writing sessions and just committing to sitting down to write, and I have to be here because I told people I'd be here, and that's really helped me be consistent and actually put out a lot more writing than I thought was possible, being that it's really only like an hour and 15 minutes that I get to sit down and do it, but I'm actually writing things instead of just thinking about writing things and hoping I'd have the time sometime. The How to Edit book wasn't as much about grammar and spelling as it was much about how to get the prose right. Yeah, how it sounds, super helpful. Best advice ever, read your writing out loud. Helped your dialogue a ton. Indeed. Indeed. Yeah. But I'd be curious to read that book though, Megan, because I think I work very big picture first and kind of fundamental layer first. And so reading several books that are about different perspectives on writing helps me build kind of like a understanding of what the editing process is. Like mentally, emotionally, this is all the pieces of it. And I just kind of build the puzzle so that I can have vision for the entire process. Because I get really bored with editing so quickly. I have to understand, like, okay, now we're doing this, and now we're doing this, and this is the outcome of that, and this affects that, and I kind of need to see big picture, all the pieces and the layers of it. When I'm learning something, that's how I learn. So reading books, even though they're not like directly about the skill that I want, I bet it would have a lot of insight into how to think about your writing, how to critique your own writing. And when you read a lot of different authors about that same sort of thing, you can start to build your own perspective on it. just sit down and write. Yep. Thanks, Melanie. Reading different layers of writing advice is wise. Oh yeah. Please send me the link. I will check it out at some point when I'm ready to dive into my next research project. I kind of need to take a break from research projects for a little while. I might have bit off a little bit more than I could chew with what I'm doing right now. But, we'll see. There's also different layers of research. There's things that you like deeply dive into research, that it's going to be like years of research on a topic. And then there's things where you're like, well, I just want to have, like, I already know a lot about writing, and so diving into editing probably wouldn't be years of research. It would just be kind of, okay, and here's another branch of an interest that I have, and I'll do a few months of research into it. All right, but we should probably begin. And I'm excited to get into this. Have any of you guys written like villains before? Because I haven't. I was looking back at everything that I've written. I don't do villains. I tend to focus more on the conflict within a group. And so there's not usually like a villain. It's like short films are hard to say I always do. They just don't give a lot of opportunity for experimenting with a lot of different story things. But with the feature, it was a romance story, and so romance, the inherent structure of romance is that you have two protagonists who are both the villains for each other and the allies for each other. That's kind of like a whole love story, is that they have conflict between each other, and that the main conflict is each other, but also the opportunities for growth and the expression of growth is in how they treat each other. And so like there isn't really room for a villain in a romance story. You can have, you know, selfish characters who have their own motives that kind of circle around, but as far as like the central conflict, it's not going to have a villain. Yeah, fun stuff, lots of villains. Say thanks for the advice in your channel. We competed in a competition for your school. Oh, cool! You won second for your short film. Congratulations! That's so cool. Oh, I'm glad it was helpful. This is very unchristian, but you love writing villains. I don't think it's unchristian. We're gonna get to that. I have some thoughts about that today. I have multiples in your book. They have no limits. Not as much as heroes do. Oh, hi, Noah. I'm glad you could be here. I didn't know if you'd be able to make it. So you're traveling today, right? John, you say yes, a lot of villains. Both the ones who sincerely believe they're doing the right thing, and also the ones who love what they do. You'll be on and off, Noah. Okay. Well, so I guess to get started, I did want to pray real quick here before we get started, so I'll go ahead and do that. And I just want to say, thank you, Lord, that we get to connect together today over creativity and over writing, and get to encourage each other and just have connection over this interest together. I pray that you would just be in everyone's process, where they're at right now, that you would give them inspiration and creativity and ideas, that you would bless them, Lord, with favor and the ability to move forward in what they're pursuing. And I pray that you would just draw our hearts toward you through this process, through our endeavors and our interests, Lord. And bless the conversation today, and please protect my equipment because it's hot, and I think last time my camera did start overheating at the end. That's what was kind of technically happening. So Lord, please protect my camera from overheating so that we don't get interrupted. That would be unfortunate. You gotta go? Got errands to run. Okay, bye! I hope you have a great rest of your day. Let's see. One other thing before we start. I'm going to record this on my laptop this time. I'm still figuring out the process. And I already turned down the AC. Okay. Alright, so to start with, these are thoughts from someone who has never actually written a villain. I wouldn't even say attempted. Like, the only real villain I feel like I've written is Ares from Weeping Willow, and that was almost 10 years ago. It was 10 years ago, actually. Almost 10 years ago at this point that I wrote that. I didn't know what I was writing. I didn't know what I was doing. And it was just like, there needs to be a villain here, so here's a villain. So I can't really claim to have a lot of experience with this, but that's what made this very interesting for me, is because I was just kind of starting from scratch on like, okay, if I were to approach making a villain, where would I start? What would I do? What's kind of the structure and the rules for this here? Because it's kind of important, as I found out as I was researching. It's kind of really, really important. So the main question, I think it was Megan actually last live stream who had suggested that I do a video about villains, and I wasn't planning to do that, but why it grabbed my attention is because there was a question that immediately came up for me, and this question is, what is the formula for a great villain? Like, I've seen analyzation videos or videos that kind of break down a few different villains, and they explain like the parts of a villain. Oh, a villain needs to be powerful and terrifying, and he needs to be able to inflict damage. It was like he needs to have his own goal. I was like, okay, but what's the formula? I don't want to just know what the output should look like. I want to know what the formula is. And so that's the question that we're going to be investigating today, is what is the villain's formula? Because that's how I think about story. I think about it as algebra. There's formulas for everything, and if you put in all the right inputs, one of the inputs being creativity and artistry, then out will come the correct answer, or an artistic answer. I don't know if there's correct, if that's a thing in art. So I think the first thing to approach, the first step, is we gotta understand how a villain fits into the larger story formula, and like what is the function of a villain or an antagonist within a story. What are the things that they have to fulfill, that they have to do? And let me get... So I'm going to be pulling a lot from this book, The Anatomy of Story, because this has had the best exploration of like the fundamentals of story that I've ever read. It's a little bit mind-blowing reading this book. But so before we get to villains, I want to go over the groundwork that John Truby lays in this book about how to develop a story and how to develop a premise for a story. Just so that we can kind of all be starting from the same place on, again, how does the villain fit into the entire story dynamic. So, chapter 2 of this book is titled Premise, and so he starts taking us through his step-by-step process of creating a premise, where he thinks it starts, and the pieces of it. And about halfway through this process, we hit determine your best character. We hit the introduction of the protagonist in the development process. And so well, let's look at these. There's determine your best character as part of the process, get a sense of the central conflict, and then a little bit further down you get determine your hero's possible character change, and then figure out your hero's possible moral choice. So the first step is going to be developing your character out of the central conflict. Because, and this is what John Truby is laying out, it is that the premise hangs on the hero. That is story. That's the way that it works. And so why John Truby starts with the premise is because you have to get it kind of right before you get too far into development. Otherwise, you're going to be stuck in like revision mode, trying to like tweak and tweak and tweak and tweak to get the characters to where you want, that they're actually fulfilling the need that the story has. And so his philosophy is start the other way. You start with getting your character and their conflict right in the premise, and he has some guidelines on how to judge whether you've done that or not before you move on to other things. So kind of to sum up these 4 points is: who is the hero and why is he the hero? What is he fighting to achieve? Why is it important to him? And what is he struggling against, right? It's the central conflict, it's the change and the moral choice, and it all hangs on who is this character. So that's going to be the first part. And the step 6 is get a sense of the central conflict. This is going to... the central conflict and understanding what it's actually about is going to be the key to your story. And so it's what is the battleground? That's the question. What are we actually fighting over? What is at stake? All those questions get wrapped up into what is the central conflict. And I think this is where a lot of writers can get kind of lost in incorporating theme into the stories. Stories aren't just simply presenting one idea or one thought about how to live. What they do is best is display a conflict. So there's core conflicts that we can all empathize with as humans, and it's what makes the stories, no matter how crazy or silly or epic, it's what continues to make them relatable, is these kind of core human conflicts. And so dealing around core conflicts, having understanding of your conflict, and not just one thought about a conflict, but understanding the whole scope of the conflict, is the value that we as writers provide to the audience. Besides just entertaining them, actually portraying the conflict and outlining the conflict and showing ways to overcome the conflict, like that is the value that we offer as writers. So conflicts involve a lot of different ideas, a lot of different perspectives, and a huge part of the development process for us as writers is to parse out from our ideas which ones actually belong as part of this conflict. And then it's not even just which ones are part of the conflict, because a lot of ideas will stack on top of each other and seemingly belong to a conflict, and that's what we have to parse out. Which ones are the fundamental ideas of the conflict, and which ones are just kind of the secondary and tertiary ideas having to do with those ideas. Does that make sense? And that's why the rule is get a sense of the central conflict here at the beginning of devising a premise. It's because you won't know. That's what development actually is the process of you not just getting a sense, but getting an understanding of the conflict and all the associating ideas. Does that make sense? So we need to get a sense here at the beginning to have a firm foundation that we're building everything else off of. But as we're building the characters, the plot, the structure, blah, 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 we're actually thinking through this conflict and seeing it from all the perspectives and getting down to what is the core conflict. What is at the bottom of this idea? And then once we get there, it's building all the structure and the character and the plot and all of that to help communicate that idea effectively. Is this making sense to you guys? Conflict. We gotta know what is at the heart of it. Okay, so one example of a movie not doing this well would be Snow White and the Huntsman. And this was one of the ones, the Queen Ravenna, the villain, was one of the villains that got voted on in the polls that I had put in the Homegrown Filmmaker group. And so I went back and watched this movie, and it was very interesting to watch. But basically what happens is the writers didn't understand the central conflict, and I think part of it is because it was being adapted from a fairy tale, and so you could kind of just steal the characters and the plot elements and put them together, and you wouldn't have to think through it all that much. You just take what's already there. So I don't think they took the time to truly understand what the conflict is. So the conflict for me on Snow White and the Huntsman was about feminine power, which was very interesting to watch a film that was made in this era, because it was kind of at the very beginning of all of the strong female character, strong female warrior trend that we're still going through and has led to not really anything great. But basically it pits these two characters as two different ideas of feminine power. So we get Queen Ravenna. She's manipulative, she's seductive, she's suspicious, she's filled with envy, misandry, which is, I recently learned this word, it's misogyny, but feminine misogyny. So prejudice and discrimination against men is what misandry is. And of course vanity, if you know, the story of Snow White is who's the fairest of them all. But Queen Ravenna's character is basically, she hates men, she cannot stand being at the mercy of men, and that's her whole character. It's why she does what she does. She wants to be the queen, she wants to be the best, and it's this depiction of dark feminine power, of twisted feminine power, as opposed to masculine power, which you can think of as the archetypal leader, king, physical strength and authority sort of idea. And then we have Snow White. Her whole character is purity, grace, compassion, inspiration, beauty, and nobility. And inspiration was really the one for me that was the power displayed in this film, that she doesn't, for the first half of the film, she's just kind of running away from Ravenna, and she's not really standing up, she's not doing anything, but the characters that come around her, because of who she is, full of purity and grace and compassion and beauty, and she gets to show, you know, those character traits throughout the story, they are inspired to rise up. They get hope. The men around her get hope to actually overthrow this evil queen and to escape from the oppression and enslavement that's happening in the land. And so that's the good feminine power, right? The ability to inspire the best from the men in our lives. And so it's like it was there. They set up the characters this way. They display the characters for the first half of the film. But as soon as we get to the midway point, which is where she takes a bite of the apple and she falls asleep, the conflict just disappears. They didn't understand that that's what was at the bottom of it, because for the rest of the story, Snow White becomes, oh right, a masculine hero, right? She's the warrior princess. She's dressed up in armor and riding horses and swinging swords, and it's like, okay, you didn't understand what the conflict was about. I want to see how good feminine power overcomes bad feminine power. That's what the conflict was. And we just got hijacked by the beginnings of the female empowerment agenda in Hollywood. Oh, we can't have just all the men fighting and she just walks through, or however they would decide to end it. No, she's got to be the strong warrior. And so they just like the plot just got hijacked on that. So it does make me curious, like, what would the ending have been? And it must have been something around, so where's the idea that Ravenna, she sucks all of the beauty and life and vitality out of all the women. And so I would have got down to a point where she was going to do that to Snow White, and it doesn't work. You know, the positive feminine traits in Snow White actually protect her from having the life and the beauty and the youth sucked out of her. But you also want to think about the best of the feminine traits, like the way that she would see Ravenna, and you think about compassion being one of the driving feminine traits, and one of the, like, you think of moms being some of the most compassionate people in the world. It's like, oh, I can see Ravenna's pain. Compassion would actually win out the day. You'd have to figure out how to do that exactly. But anyway, this is an example. They did not understand what the conflict was, and so the plot just gets hijacked, and there's characters there who aren't doing anything, and the choices that the characters make are just kind of like arbitrary because, okay, we're all gonna go fight the bad guy now. It's just not really drawn together very well at the end. So, this is what I mean by understanding the core conflict, so that you don't get off track. But going back to the anatomy of story, the second chapter's premise, the third chapter is the seven key steps of story structure. And so basically, since the story hangs on the protagonist, you build your plot structure around the journey of the character, right? So figuring out your key structure steps leads both to building out your character and the plot organically at the same time. And let's take a look at what this is talking about. These are the 7 key steps of story structure. So you got weakness and need. That's the moral failings of your character. That's weakness. And need is what they need to grow into, the change that they need. And again, those were the earlier steps of the premise, starting to kind of outline that. Weakness and need. Desire, what they're going after, what's going to be the thrust of the plot, as you were. As you will, whatever that saying is. And then third one is opponent. So now we're coming back to the villain. The villain is actually part of building the character, is basically what John Truby is saying. Figuring out your villain and how they're part of the conflict is part of developing your protagonist. Hang on, that was my power cord. I don't want that too. Alright. And then there's plan, which is how they plan to achieve their desire. Battle is where the protagonist and antagonist go back and forth and they fight, and then it leads to the ultimate battle at the end that's going to decide the conflict for good. Self-revelation, this is what we think of as the dark moment, the change when the hero realizes the effects that the weakness was having, the immoral or unsuccessful actions that he was taking because of his weakness, why it wasn't working and what he needs to change. That's a self-revelation. And then at the end is the new equilibrium. We know that one. So this is building the plot and the character growth at the same time, out of the same place. It's going to link them intrinsically, and that's why he has structured it this way. Part of that is the opponent. You can't build a character who is going to fight and grow unless you also build what he's fighting against, right? That's the whole idea here. So I'm gonna say that the first part of the formula of creating a great villain is to create a great hero with a great conflict. You can't really get away from that. And so that's something to think about. He's not isolated as his own thing. It's always going to be connected to what this battle actually is, because you can come up with a cool idea for a villain, but if he's not the villain for this conflict, the story is just not going to work, right? And a great conflict, and I really mean that. What are the great conflicts of life? What are the great fundamental difficult conflicts that we have to grapple with? Because that's actually what's going to give your story roots. And what do they call them? Legs. Legs in the story. So here's a quote from the book that I wanted to read. Writers often mistakenly think of the opponent, also known as the antagonist, as the character who looks evil, sounds evil, or does evil things, and this way of looking at the opponent will prevent you from ever writing a good story. Instead, you must see the opponent structurally in terms of his function in the story. A true opponent not only wants to prevent the hero from achieving his desire, but is competing with the hero for the same goal. And if you look at a number of good stories, it often appears at first glance that the hero and the opponent are not competing for the same goal. But look again. See if you can spot what they are really fighting about. What is the core conflict? For example, in a detective story, it appears that the hero wants to catch the killer and the killer wants to get away. But what they are really fighting about is which version of reality everyone will believe. And so, the Snow White and the Huntsman example, that how would I say that? What they were fighting over is feminine power, the idea of what a woman is, what femininity is and should be. That was the fundamental conflict, but they didn't understand that. They just thought it was, oh, we're going to defeat the evil queen. They understood some part of it, though, because they built out the character enough. That's why Queen Ravenna is so iconic, is you don't see characters like her very often, where she is this portrayal of negative femininity, dark femininity, I don't know what you would call it. Yeah, you just don't see that terribly often. And you probably wouldn't see that today because so many strong female characters are given traits of dark femininity and told, oh, they're so powerful, they're so independent. It's either that or they're made entirely masculine. All right, this is another quote from the book. Note that writers often talk about having a hero whose opponent is himself, and this is a mistake that will cause all kinds of structural problems. When we talk about a hero fighting himself, we are really referring to a weakness within the hero. So now we're getting into what an opponent is. It's not the conflict within the character. That's the weakness. Overcoming weakness, that's going to be the conflict in the character. The opponents stand for completely different values, and I've heard that idea before too, that the opponent is kind of like an extension of the conflict that's going on within the character. It's like, that's almost right, almost, and we'll get into more about what that's actually supposed to look like, what the opponent is actually doing there. He's not an extension of the conflict within the character. The conflict within the character is overcoming weakness, whatever that weakness looks like. Before we get too much further, I did want to clarify how I'm using this terminology, and this is just how I'm using it. I don't think these are like set labels. This is the way that it has to be. This is just how I'm using it. So I'll use 3 different words. I'll use opponent, and antagonist, and villain. So an opponent is a character with values that are opposed to the protagonist. They're gonna be in conflict because they don't value the same things. They don't think the same things are important. They just don't see the world the same way. So doesn't have to be an antagonist. It doesn't have to be a villain even. It could be someone who is even more mature and better than the protagonist. They're still gonna be an opponent because they're in conflict, right? The antagonist is the main opponent who is designed to put the greatest pressure on the protagonist's weaknesses. So there's the connection to the inner conflict isn't about the inner conflict is about overcoming weakness. And so the antagonist doesn't have to be an extension of the same conflict within the character. They're just the character that can put the pressure on your protagonist that highlights his weakness or causes him to lean on his weakness so much that he can see it. If your character's weakness is that he's a coward, for instance, and the villain doesn't have to stand for fear. He's not like a manifestation of fear. He's just someone who can scare the protagonist. Does that make sense? And so because the protagonist struggles with cowardliness, he's going to run away, that's going to cause problems, and out of that he can see why he needs to grow out of cowardliness, because he either grows or he gets destroyed. That's the alternative, and that is the pressure that the antagonist, the main opponent, puts on your protagonist. Figure out the hero to order to figure out the villain. I know, it's like, oh, I loved reading this book, because it was like, oh, okay, I see. You can actually, because that was always my problem. I'd be like, okay, I have a great idea for a character. What do you do with it? I guess I have to come up with other great ideas. How do you come up with great ideas? Like, seemed an impossible task to me. But actually understanding, oh, they're coming out of the same thing. They're connected. They're part of each other. This ecosystem of the story works together. I can pull questions and put boundaries around what my antagonist needs to be in order to be creative with it and actually figure that out. This is a quote from the book. I don't think I have it on the slide, but I'll read it. The single most important element of a great opponent is that he be necessary to a hero. And this has a very specific structural meaning. The main opponent is the one person in the world best able to attack the greatest weakness of the hero, and he should attack it relentlessly. The necessary opponent either forces the hero to overcome his weakness or destroys him. Right. Put another way, the necessary opponent makes it possible for the hero to grow. So that's his quote explaining kind of what I was just explaining as well. It's not that the villain is a manifestation of the inner conflict. It's that he puts pressure that highlights the inner conflict for the audience, but also for the character, that they can actually see the consequences of their weakness. That's the idea. All right, lastly on this, a villain is someone who knowingly causes harm to others. So I think antagonists can unknowingly cause harm either out of ignorance or lack of awareness. They're not aware of how their actions are affecting people. But a villain to me is someone who's motivated in a course of action and is determined to pursue it no matter the cost to anyone else. This is where you get people who seem to have altruistic goals, right? Thanos, in his own understanding, has an altruistic goal. He's trying to save the universe from overpopulation and overconsumption. And so he's determined that no matter how many people have to die, his cause, his understanding of the world is worth it, right? That makes him a villain. Someone who knowingly causes harm, who has counted the cost of what they want to do and is fine with it. If you can replace the antagonist or villain with any other antagonist, villain, and nothing changes for the story character, you done did it wrong. Yes. Anybody have any thoughts or questions they'd like to add? Like I said, I've never done this before, so in theory, I understand all of it. In theory, it seems clear to me on the page. But if you guys have any added thoughts for me, I'd love to hear them. I guess maybe here is where I could talk a little bit about genres. And I decided that for villains today, I'm going to be talking primarily about genres who have like mega iconic villains. And that's typically horror, action, thriller, and crime. Those tend to be the ones that have these villains that are so evil and so iconic that we remember them. And that's really because those are the genres that deal in physical conflict. The baseline of the conflict is physical, and so they tend to not be about the inner self, is I guess what I would say. If you guys have not heard of this book, I cannot recommend it enough. I haven't even finished reading it. Oh my gosh. So this is Anatomy of Story, John Truby's first book. This is his next book, and it just came out, I think, last year or a couple years ago. The Anatomy of Genres. Oh my goodness, this is so insightful, and I can't. Anyway, it outlines what the fundamentals of each genre is and why, and how it's part of telling human stories, and what does it mean, what each of them fundamentally are, which part of being human each one is fundamentally tackling. All that to say, I don't think that villains belong in every genre. Like, those main genres, horror, thriller, action, also myth, like that deals a lot in physical conflict and crime. Those are the ones that really require like a villain. If you're gonna tell a romance, like I said, if you're gonna tell a coming of age story, if you're gonna tell a comedy, you know, the villains, rather than being a specific character who is putting pressure on weakness, tend to be more of this idea of a system of characters who all contribute to the beliefs and system that the protagonist is trapped in how they treat each other and how they connect with one another. And so there's not like one villain that needs to be overcome. It's about the protagonist transcending this system that everyone is trapped in. And you see that in drama, you see that in romance, you see that in somewhat in comedy. Comedy can kind of fudge the lines on that one. And so I'll finish my thought before I read those. You're not looking at villains, you're looking at systems of characters who are explaining, again, all the sides of this conflict, how they feed into each other, and how they keep everyone oppressed. So far what you're saying makes a lot of sense. I always say story and characters should be like a tapestry, pull on a thread and the whole thing should unravel. Right. You're giving you another book to read. Sorry. But I think especially if you're going to tackle a feature film or a big project that is in one of those genres, or in any of the genres really, take a look at that book. You don't even have to read the whole thing because it covers, I think it's 14 different genres that he kind of covers. And so if you're just like, I need to look up the one genre that I'm like functioning in right now, you can do that. I have done that. I haven't read the whole thing yet, is why. That's why I have not read the whole thing yet, because I just keep looking up genres as I come across them. Alright, but we are going to move on to chapter 4 of The Anatomy of Story, which is about developing characters. How do you develop a character? Here's the quote. To create great characters, think of all your characters as part of a web in which each helps define the others. To put it another way, a character is often defined by who he is not. Key point, the most important step in creating your hero, as well as all other characters, is to connect and compare each to the others. They're all connected. You have to understand how they are putting pressure on each other and showing each other's weaknesses and showing where the lines are, you know, showing the difference between this course of action and this belief system and that course of action and where it leads. That is the value. Again, the value of story is showing people different models of how to live. And within the story, you compare different models of how to live. And that is the value. Thoughts on the villain that lures the hero into embracing their weakness? I think you'd have to figure that out very carefully, because and you're gonna have to have some sort of, and again, it depends on what genre you're in, but you're gonna have to have some sort of secondary villain or secondary antagonistic force that the character is facing, right? You're gonna need something that's gonna be the push against the character and the drive against the character, right? And then here's the real villain behind the scenes trying to get the character to give in to their weakness for their own reasons, right? But I mean, we'll get into some thoughts about this later. I think it would get confusing on what you're saying the center conflict actually is, because when you present two different ideas, here's the false real conflict, and here's the real conflict, you have to be very clear which one is the actual core conflict. Does that make sense? Like, and I don't know if you have to spell that out for the audience, but you have to be very clear on it for yourself. All right, but we're going to talk about ways to do that. I think this will be very interesting for you, John. Where were we? Right. The most important step in creating your hero, as well as all the other characters, is to connect and compare each to the others. And as John Truby explains, as you go through the book, this connect and compare ideas with the characters has to happen in the context of the theme. And he describes theme as your view on the proper way to act in the world, expressed through your characters as they take action in the plot. That's kind of what I was saying. This is your idea of how to live, and each of the characters kind of represents a thought on how to live. Thus, you have the face and the mastermind types. Yes. Theme is not subject matter such as racism or freedom. Theme is your moral vision, your view of how to live well or badly, and it's unique for each story that you write. It's not just unique to each story that you write, it's unique to each writer and each story that you write. And this, again, is like the heart of the value that you are offering as an artist, is this unique perspective that you have. Nobody else has what you have. Nobody else is going to write what you're going to write. And it's all about this idea, what is models of ways to live, put in conflict with each other. So, John Truby has developed his formula for organically creating the hero and his opponents out of the theme, and it's called four corner opposition. I'm really excited. I love this formula. And we're going to get into examples of it. It's going to be lots of fun. Okay, so four corner opposition. We're going to watch a video about it because these videos explain so much better than I ever could. What four corner so I'm not sure what the audio is doing, so I'm going to tell you on here. Okay, so this video can explain four corner opposition better than I could, so I thought we could just watch a piece of it as they kind of explain it, so I don't have to re-explain it. Okay, there, you should be able to hear me and hear the video. Please post in the chat if you can't hear the video. You can't hear the video? I thought I had figured this out. Let me go see. So sorry guys, bear with me. Okay, you can't hear it. I don't know what to do about that. Let me go. You should be able to hear it. Why can I hear it? It's okay, you're baking anyways, take your time. Oh, thanks, gals. I'm trying to figure out why I can hear it. Can you hear it now? I don't know. I don't know if you guys can hear that. Okay. Let me try something. How about now? Okay, you can't hear it. Why? Why can you not hear it? Okay. This is gonna be janky.
Character personifying.
I don't think that's a good idea. to think about what to do. I thought I had gotten this figured out. Sorry, guys. And it's like OBS, the program I'm using, was not made for Mac or something. It's only made for Windows users, because for everything that I'm trying to do, it's like, oh yeah, it'd be so simple on Windows. In Mac, you have to download like 3 different plugins and connect them all together. It's like, what? Maybe... you could read the captions. Well, that's not nearly as much fun. All right, I'm going to we're just gonna do this kind of I'll try to explain it. No, that's... Alright, just give me a sec, guys. I'm preparing. My own presentation real quick. Okay. All right. All right. Let me see if I can explain this. Put the captions on. I don't know if I like that idea. For people who are just like listening as they're going about time, that seems a little bit difficult. For those who are just listening, we are going to be looking at things now. And so this might get a little confusing if you're not actually looking at your screen. But, okay, so four-corner opposition is... What the video was explaining is that John Truby said that if you view your story with the idea that it's just going to be one idea versus the other idea, it's this binary idea, and it lacks the ability to show a character within a society and show like how all of these different characters and ideas connect and put pressure on each other and work together as a society. And so he developed what he calls four-corner opposition. And basically four-corner opposition is, instead of having a binary idea, is that you have two values that are in conflict with each other. And so you could think of this as your binary. Like if we were to take like this is not a negative and a positive idea. It's two ideas that conflict with one another. Like trying to think of an example. Hang on, I lost my screen for a minute. For instance, let's say this, oops, this is value 1 is loyalty, and value 2 is purpose. And so if those come into conflict when your loyalty keeps you from pursuing your purpose, right? So this is not a positive and a negative like I outlined with the Snow White and the Huntsman, where it's okay, here's positive femininity and negative femininity. These are two values that are in conflict, that can come into conflict with one another. And so you start with those values, and then you take each value and you come up with the positive and the negative of that value. And that creates 4 corners. So I'm going to run through some examples of this that'll help kind of illuminate it, hopefully. And I'm going to use the villains that you guys all voted for in the polls in the group. So here's Hopper, because I wanted to start with him because he's just a super, Bug's Life is a super solid example of this idea. So usually you have your protagonist as the, okay, well, so what I identified as the values in A Bug's Life is the individual versus the system. That's the core conflict that's at play. And usually your protagonist is the positive of value 1. So that's Flick, right? He's the protagonist of A Bug's Life. And I put him as the positive individuality because he's this inventor, he's creative, he is interested in expressing all of himself and pursuing his own dreams, right? And so he stands for individual and the promise and the, what would you call that? Just the potential of the individual. There's that whole speech that he and Dot have about the rock being a seed. I mean, that's a really funny scene, but it's about how within us is this seed of potential, and all that we are is inside of it, and we're going to grow up into this big tree, who we are. You know, it's like this idea of the individual being potential. So there's the positive expression of the individual. The positive expression of the second value is the system, and this is portrayed in the character of Princess Ada, but it's really the ant colony altogether. But Princess Ada is the leader of the ant colony, and so she bears responsibility for it, and she kind of is the one who bears pressure on Flick. No, fall in line, do what everyone else is doing, because that's what we do. We're ants. This is how we support each other. This is what our system is. It works. It provides food. It keeps us safe. You have to stay within the system for the good of you and for the good of the colony. So it's a positive expression of that. The negative expression of these ideas is going to be the other characters, right? So the bug, the circus clowns, and this was one that wasn't quite as clear to me because this opponent actually kind of gets neutralized pretty early on in the story. It's like they go to the ant colony and they're chased by the bird, and they do this daring rescue, and all of the ants love them, and that's kind of where this conflict comes to an end. But they're an expression of negative individuality because they're all of these disparate artists, and I thought that was really insightful of the creators to make them artists and thespians, and like, right, these tend to be the super individual, unique, I do this for my art type of people, kind of cast out from the regular circles of society because of their individuality and their refusal to bow to the system, right? That's kind of the stereotype with artists. And so there are all these disparate artists who have no community. They have no grounding force to them, and they have no purpose besides just themselves and their art and pursuing that. And so that's the negative expression of the individual. They don't have structure, they don't have a system that they are part of, that they're contributing to. And then Hopper is the negative expression of the system, because Hopper is all about enforcing the order, right? This is the way that it is. That's the whole speech between him and Princess Ada. The ants pick the food, the ants... I don't remember the whole line. What was the line? the ants pick the food, the grasshoppers eat the food, and everyone gets left alone or gets protected. That's the whole idea of Hopper. He is there to enforce his idea of order. And you'll usually see this as well, where the protagonist will be the positive of value 1, and the antagonist, so this is the main opponent who is putting the most pressure on the protagonist, will be the negative expression of the second value. And so they're diametrically opposed. But by offering more perspectives on the same conflict, it allows a lot more plot to exist and a lot more conflict to happen, because not only is Flick in conflict with Hopper, he's in conflict with Ada, and he's in conflict with the circus bugs. But the circus bugs are also in conflict with Hopper, and Ada's in conflict with Hopper, and Ada's also in conflict with the circus bugs. And so the levels of conflict, there can be an exponential level of conflict happening, because all of these characters have conflict with each other. They're not just in conflict with the protagonist. And they all have things in conflict, and they all have things in common. And so sometimes when breaking down these stories, I could find kind of a label for the negative and positive that worked. It's not always the case, but on this one, what makes them negative and positive is that both Flick and Ada have the purpose of the betterment of the colony. That's actually what makes them good, right? It's not just that Flick wants to pursue his own things for his own sake. All of his inventions, all of his ideas are to make life easier for the colony. All of his experimentation is directed toward life in the colony. He actually wants to do it for other people. And that's the difference between him and the circus bugs. And because they are just interested in their individuality for themselves and doing their own thing and doing it their way and suffering for their art and all of that. Same with Ada. She didn't want the system to want the system. She actually wants it because she believes it's best for the colony, that this is what has worked, this is what has kept us safe. And when you rock the boat, Flick, you put us all in danger. You put the system in danger. And then obviously Hopper, he doesn't just want he doesn't just want order because he likes order. He wants to be in charge. It's his own self-interest. I want to be at the top of the order. And so this is four corner opposition, and it's how you build out plot and opponents. And so answering your question, John, about an opponent who draws the hero towards their weakness, I think that all the opponents should draw hey, there it is. I can turn on the laser pointer. I was wondering where that was. All of the opponents should put pressure on the protagonist, which pushes them toward their weakness. So the weakness is not a part of this, as you can see. That's part of building the individual character. But this is how the antagonist and the protagonist are connected. And sometimes you can use the different opponents to, like you said, one is kind of the face and the other is the mastermind. Or you could have one of them is a kind of like anti-hero where they actually kind of switch sides, or it's what John Truby calls a fake ally opponent. It's someone who seems like an ally at first, but then later is either revealed to become an opponent, or they actually shift to become an opponent. And so that's where this setup kind of really works, because when you actually build them to have values in common and values that oppose each other, such as Flick and Ada here, these characters could share the same purpose at the beginning of the story, but as the protagonist gets deeper and deeper into their weakness and they're acting out of their weakness and doing wrong things or doing at least unsuccessful things, the other character starts going, hey, that's not what I signed up for. I'm actually on this other team, or I'm not going to help you anymore, or you actually need to be stopped because you're hurting people and I'm going to stop. You know, they turn into an opponent through the story. This gives you lots and lots of avenues to play with and look at, and it also helps you just examine your core conflict much more closely. The interesting thing here, I think, is and we might see some examples of this, instead of seeing the antagonist over on the negative value of value 2, they might be over here as the negative value of value 1. And those stories are super interesting because these characters have a lot in common, right? These characters have like nothing in common. These characters have something in common. And so often the plot of a story where this is actually the main antagonist looks a lot different. It's more interesting to play with, because basically what you're saying is, oh, you think that the audience, you trick the audience into thinking that this is the core conflict to start with, the individual versus the system, or value 1 versus value 2. But through the course of the story, you reveal actually the core conflict that this story is actually about is this conflict, this positive and negative conflict. And so you end up saying something really different about the conflict when you rearrange the characters. Don't know if I've ever thought of Bug's Life like that, but that totally makes sense. I know, it was really interesting to take the examples that y'all suggested, because I wasn't looking for examples that fit into the four corner opposition. I took the examples that you guys suggested and I went to see if I could apply four corner opposition to them, and it was really a lot of fun. Let me fix this. It's bothering me. There we go. Okay. So to move on to another example, we're going to talk about another villain, and that is Azula. Azula was very interesting to figure out because she is part of the TV series, and in TV series you have so many characters, and actually you'll find that four corner opposition is more common in TV series because they're built on these casts of characters, and they have to kind of outline how all the characters could be in conflict with each other in different episodes. That's what you'll see in like a what's that called? An episode, or a like a I forgot the names of the different types of TV shows, but like, you know, like a cop show where the episode is kind of, they solve a mystery every time instead of being a series, like a whole through line of the character. I can't think of why I can't think of the name right now, but you just have this cast of characters, and they can kind of be reconfigured to be opponents or allies for each other however you like per episode, or per episode arc, or whatever you want to think about it. So you tend to find tons and tons of four corner oppositions, like here's the main four corner opposition, but then we'll take one of the characters and build three other characters around them that create a different four corner opposition, and that's what we see with Azula. So if we're going to start with the main four corner opposition for the entire series of The Last Airbender, we're going to start, of course, with the values that I think that are in conflict at the core of this. And the ones that I saw, somebody else could break it down a little bit differently, are responsibility versus entitlement. And so, as usual, we're going to have our protagonist in the positive expression of the first value. Aang's journey is all about responsibility. It's what he struggles with, right? He constantly feels guilty that the world became what it did because he was missing for 100 years and he ran away from his destiny, and he feels majorly responsible for that, and he questions, should I run from this responsibility? How do I face this responsibility? Which pieces of this are my fault and things that I should take responsibility for, and which parts are other people's fault and I have nothing to do with, and just the responsibility of being the Avatar and having the weight of the world on his shoulders is something that he grapples with the entire series, right? Just a second, I'm gonna drink. Now, the negative expression of responsibility is Zuko. what's Zuko's whole thing? It's regain my honor, right? But when we get into Zuko's backstory, we discover that what he did to lose his honor wasn't actually something that was dishonorable. And so he takes on this false responsibility. He feels responsible for things that were not his fault, that were not evil things to do. And he takes on the responsibility of this massive, overwhelming quest to capture the Avatar, which at the time he was tasked with that, nobody knew where the Avatar was or if he was still alive or anything like that. So this impossible task that he takes responsibility for, and he is struggling so hard with the weight of, and that's what Iroh is, they're saying is like, this isn't your responsibility. This actually isn't a good course to take. But Zuko is so set in, I have to take responsibility for this, that it leads him to a lot of wrong actions. And this is an example of, like I said, a character shifting throughout the story, where he starts as an opponent but he becomes an ally as he changes. And so this four corner opposition is really only true for the first season. The second season it's a little bit muggier, and definitely by the third season I wouldn't say that Zuko is one of Aang's main opponents anymore, but I think he's just a really good expression of the negative side of responsibility, false guilt, false responsibility. Alright, value 2 is entitlement, and of course, on the negative expression of entitlement, there's explain. Aang is legitimate responsibility, Zuko is wrongful responsibility. And we're going to see that tie over to the other ones. So, the main antagonist of the entire series, of course, is Ozai, the Fire Lord, that dude. And so I put him as the negative of entitlement because he feels that he is entitled to the entire world. He can do whatever he wants. He can kill whoever he wants. He can subjugate whoever he wants because that is his right, his entitlement as the Fire Lord of the greatest expression of the Fire Nation ever to exist in this universe, right? That's the that is the narrative of the Fire Nation, I guess, is that they're this great nation, and because they're better than everyone else, they have the right to subjugate and kill and destroy everyone else according to their whims. So that's the negative expression of entitlement. And the legitimate expression of entitlement, I would say, is the world itself. And this is expressed through a lot of different characters. This is usually the character that gets switched out per episode. As they meet different people, as they travel the land. Sometimes it's even Katara and Sokka who are expressing this idea, but it's the rightful entitlement that the way the universe is set up, the Avatar is actually supposed to be the arbiter of all of these conflicts between the nations, right? And because he was gone, because he was missing, their world got decimated. And don't they have some legitimate entitlement to Aang's protection and judgment and his sacrifice, really? You know, don't they actually have claim to Aang as the Avatar, as their savior, as their protector? It's legitimate entitlement. And as he comes into conflict with all these different characters, that's kind of the discussion of like there's the one where he goes to the, what's that one? It's like a fire festival or something, and Kyoshi, they hold Kyoshi as guilty for all these crimes, and so they decide to hold Aang, put Aang through a trial in place of Kyoshi, who is a former Avatar. Right? That's the entitlement. We are entitled to judge you because of a previous Avatar's actions against us. And the whole conflict of that episode is Aang going, but that wasn't me. That wasn't my fault, right? You don't actually have entitlement to me. You can't claim that I'm responsible. And that's that whole conflict between responsibility and entitlement. So, the villain that we're looking at here is Azula, though. So where Azula falls on here is she's kind of an expression of Ozai's will in the first couple seasons. So she kind of just falls into the same value bracket as Ozai. It's this entitlement to everything. It's when you get into some different four corner oppositions that you can really look at her personality. So we're going to do that. We're going to look at Azula in season 3 specifically. And I think she belongs as the villain to Zuko's protagonist. She's not really Aang's villain in season 3. It's Zuko who faces off with her at the end. So the values at play that I saw were excellence and mastery. And we're going to put Zuko in the positive expression of excellence. That's kind of his journey of season 3, is how do I become a good person, an excellent person? How do I pursue being a good person to the best of my ability, helping the right people to the best of my ability, my skills and my wisdom and my beliefs to the best of my ability. His whole focus is excellence. And I'm going to put Azula as the negative expression of that. So she doesn't really sit as the main antagonist for Zuko. And that's a little bit fudgy because some of the episodes she is, some of the episodes she isn't the main antagonist for Zuko. And so as far as building out the character web, though, I felt that this was where she belonged. What is Azula's character, right? It's like the perfection. I have to be perfect. That's her whole thing in the 3rd season. Not a hair out of line. Almost perfect is not good enough, is kind of her thing. I would say that the trying to put a label on the positive and negative was possible in this circumstance, and it was the internal excellence versus external excellence, right? Zuko's concerned about what kind of person he is and his actions and his beliefs. Azula's interested in her image and her performance and her output, right? Internal versus external. So we stick Ozai in the negative of mastery, and Iroh goes in the positive of mastery. And Ozai is the expression of external mastery, right? Again, he wants to be in control of everyone else, master over everyone else, master over the world, master over all the power. That's his character. Iroh is again internal mastery, and he comes into conflict with Zuko in season 3 over the fact that Zuko won't listen to him, that Zuko is not striving for excellence, that Zuko doesn't want to engage with everything that Iroh believes will make him a better person. And that's where they come into conflict, is that excellence versus mastery, and how, and especially the second half of the 3rd season, Zuko goes wrong in his pursuit of excellence because he believes that, okay, to be an excellent son, I have to do what my father says. To be the excellent prince, I have to act this way. And his struggle throughout the season is, okay, but that's not really excellent. That's not really what it means to be a good person, right? And so that's the excellent versus mastery idea, that in the pursuit of excellence, you can go wrong. But in the pursuit of mastery of yourself, internal mastery, Iroh is the expression of not going wrong, of holding true to your values, and seeing it through to the end. And John Truby talks about how when you're building out these characters, it's not that everything that they are is just this one idea. So excellence, Zuko is just going to personify excellence. That's all he's going to do. He says, no, it's these cluster of values that belong with this idea. And so you can kind of see that in these characters because they're very, very iconic, and they're very unique, and they all have their own personalities, and that comes from kind of building out of these clusters of values that belong with where they're at around the center conflict. I'm reading the comments. Episodic versus serialized. Is that the names? For in my head, serialized means the episodic, but I that's backwards. It's episodic versus serialized. Yeah. I must restore my honor. Yes. Thank you so much for saying their names correctly. I'm a fan of the show, not a fan of the movie. Okay. Anyway, So just the reason that Avatar works, we all know so well, is because of how well built the characters are. And this is a lot of why. It's because there's a lot of thought and understanding put into the conflicts of the characters, but it's the values of the characters that these characters are built around are actually in conflict with one another in different ways. And so this is why TV show writers love this kind of stuff, because, right, we get episodes where Zuko's in conflict with Azula, we get episodes where Zuko's in conflict with Ozai, we get episodes where he's in conflict with Iroh, and he's in conflict with all of them, and then once he joins the gang, he's kind of in conflict with Katara, and he kind of transitions out of his own protagonist storyline for a while once he joins the gang, and he's part of Aang's four corner opposition again. But it's like Aang has two. He has like his external opponents, like Ozai, like what I laid out, Ozai and the other nations and blah 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 blah, and then he has like his internal ones as well, because often there'll be episodes where it's like Katara and Sokka and Zuko, or Katara and Sokka and Toph are all acting as opponents in this internal conflict that he's having, right? And so understanding all the values associated with all of your characters allows you to pair them in interesting ways that puts them in conflict and growth with one another, and that's the whole idea behind TV series, basically. And the other core idea of the TV series is that they're all stuck in a situation that they can't get out of, that puts them into conflict with each other as well. So Azula, looking at her specifically, when you take the pursuit of external excellence as your highest, deepest value, what you get is Azula, right? She values control. She cannot tolerate imperfection. She cannot tolerate it in anyone around her or anyone, or in herself as well. And that's her whole story with Ty Lee and May in the third season. They become imperfect friends for her, and so she rejects them. She cannot tolerate them in her life anymore. So she values perfection and power, but what it causes in her is this massive insecurity, and we get a backstory for why that is. And that insecurity eventually is what cracks her sanity. She cannot cope with the idea that she is not perfect, and with the idea that she is not worthy to be loved, because she thinks that perfection is where her worth is. And so they built the values, and then they carried them out to the furthest conclusion. And that's where you end up with Azula. You know, why she makes such a great villain is both that they understood the core of her and they followed it all the way to the end. That makes her great. That makes the story great. But she was great before we got to that point, and it's because they understood what the root conflicts were and how she would use others' weakness against them. Alright, next we're going to look at Snow White and the Huntsman again, to show you how this didn't apply to all the movies that I looked at. And maybe if they had done this for Snow White and the Huntsman, they would have could have fixed the ending a little bit, because it would have given them more plot and more interesting conflict happening on multiple angles. So like I said, I think it's about the feminine, but that's like one value. And so I was trying to think of what a different value could have been, and the most obvious is, let's see, we already went through that they're positive and negative expressions of the feminine. But the most obvious one that I could think of was the masculine. And then we're going to get positive and negative examples of that. And in the characters that exist in the film, there was one obvious one for a negative expression, but like he didn't really have his own values. You know what I mean? He was kind of just an extension of Ravenna in the film. He didn't stand for something different than Ravenna. And so Ravenna and him didn't exactly have conflict. He failed her, right? He fails in the task that she set him, and so she gets mad at him. That's not the same as conflict. And so that wasn't really terribly well built out. And then for the positive expression of masculine, we have several options, and there isn't really enough there in the characters to say which should be the option, and that's probably what I would have done, is built out one of these characters a little bit better, to kind of exemplify positive masculinity, or some, you know, it didn't even have to be masculinity that was the other value, some other value that they were trying to portray, and make one of that character that expression of that value. But there's also 3 of them. You could make a second four-corner opposition for Snow and be like, okay, here's the huntsman, and here's her cousin or her friend the prince, and here's the dwarves, and this is a different four-corner opposition that is maybe about faith or loyalty or inspiration or something like that, because that's really her relationship with all these characters, is she inspires hope in them again, but they're not really different from each other in terms of values. The huntsman has some backstory. William is her friend. These dwarves help her because, you know, dwarves are part of the story of Snow White, and so they have to be in it. But really, she performs the same function for all of them, and that's what I mean by I can't really differentiate from them enough to put one in this corner or to build out a different four-corner opposition. So if they had done this, it would have helped them define their conflict a little bit better and define their characters a little bit better, especially the prince. Like, I feel like they just created the huntsman character as the expression, or as the character that's in the movie, because they were like, hey, fake out, what if the prince doesn't kiss her? This huntsman does. And that's as far as they got with that thought. Like, they didn't really put thought into why. Like, when you look at the conflict, why should he kiss her instead of the prince? And what would that say about the story? And where would that go? Like, anyway, it just kind of falls apart when you try and figure out the system here that they're trying to portray. Never seen Avatar like 8 times, and you've never broken down the characters like that. Well, I hadn't either until I sat down to actually diagram it out, and I was like, what values could be here? Right. Alright, we can move on to the next example. This was another villain that was suggested in the polls, but this was in the villains that just failed entirely, and that is Whiplash from Iron Man 2. And Iron Man 2 was interesting to look at because, again, I couldn't really find a four-corner opposition, and what I mostly saw was, obviously there's Tony, who's the main character, and his conflict centers around the fact that he's dying, and he attempts to fix it, but he thinks there's not a way to fix it, and so for a large portion of the movie, he's just faced with his own mortality, right? That's kind of it, and that's his journey, is learning to be a good person in the face of mortality, but then he figures out how not to die, and we move on to action blowing up stuff. So really the only values that I could kind of find, and they're not really values, is there's this camp, which is there's Pepper, there's Rhodey, and then there's like all of S.H.I.E.L.D., so that's both Nick Fury and Coulson and Black Widow, who's introduced in this movie. And I couldn't really find a differentiation between those characters, so I just lumped them all together as like S.H.I.E.L.D., Nick Fury's agenda. And that side is just, you know, Tony, get your act together. You are hurting us, you're hurting the world with how you're lashing out because, well, they don't know what's going on, but it's because he's dying, but they just see him being weird and crazy and an ass, and like, so basically all the conversations between Tony and them boil down to, Tony, get your act together. And then on the other side, we just have Destroy Tony Stark, and we have both Justin Hammer and Whiplash. And I watched a really interesting breakdown of this that was talking about how in some ways they were like trying to do this thing where these characters were a reflection of Tony. You know, Justin Hammer is Tony as he would have been without Iron Man, as he would have been as continuing to be this mega weapons dealer, showman ass who just did what he wanted and wanted to be at the top and prided himself in being successful and at the top and being able to have whatever he wanted. That's kind of Justin Hammer. And I could kind of see how Whiplash, they were trying to do, this is the other side of Tony, right? This is the inventor Tony. This is the Tony who put together Iron Man with a box of scraps in a cave, you know, that line. Like, that's supposed to be that expression of the character, but it really just... And he's supposed to have parallels as well, like his dad worked with Tony's dad, and that's kind of it. Tony's dad didn't love him. Ivan's dad did love him. Again, they're supposed to be like these parallels and comparisons, but they didn't really work because destroy Tony Stark is not a conflict of values. It's just, I want to die, I want to live, and I want to die, and I want you to die. And so it's really just the most basic level of conflict, and he didn't really have anything to do with the rest of the story. And the most basic level of conflict works for about one scene, and that's what we see with Whiplash, right? He has the one iconic scene with the whips on the racetrack, and he's destroying cars, and he's gonna hit Tony, and Tony gets the suitcase, and you know, all that sort of stuff. But after that, he doesn't really stand out in any way. He doesn't have any values in conflict. I think part of the problem too is that Justin and Whiplash don't have any values, are not very different from each other. They kind of have the same value, which is destroy Tony Stark. And so even though like Justin's using Ivan, and then Ivan like betrays him and ends up being the one at the end, what they're really just fighting over is who gets to destroy Tony Stark, and it's just not a compelling story at all. So I think if they had wanted to fix Iron Man 2, this is what the video suggested, was actually to get rid of Whiplash and to be more clear on what make some of these characters the four corner opposition. And you almost have a four corner opposition where it's Tony and then these three, but these three don't really have different expressions of Tony, get your act together. Like, if you wanted to make them a four corner opposition, you would have to give them different values on what get your act together looks like, or what they think a successful, happy Tony would look like. Or maybe happiness isn't even the value. So like Pepper, she's like, well, I just want you to be happy. And Rhodey's like, well, I just want you to be functional and to be a good person so that the United States Army doesn't have to worry about what you're doing with all of your impressive weaponry. And Nick Fury could be, well, I see so much more in you. You could be a hero, you know. And it's like there's little pieces of that, but they're not really outlined that way in the story. So anyway, I think that's Iron Man 2, and it's some of why it flopped, and definitely why Whiplash is just like there. He has that one memorable scene, and he could have been more if they had figured out how to build out the values a little bit better. All right, just a few more. We're going to talk about Barbossa. I had to think long and hard about this movie to try and figure out if there was a four corner opposition. And part of the issue is I think it's not quite four corners. I think it's 5. And you can do that if you can outline them. But I settled on 4 because I couldn't exactly differentiate 2 of the characters. And I'll show you what I mean. But if you think about this is about Curse of the Black Pearl specifically. I didn't want to dive into all the sequels because, again, you get into... There's like 5 or 6 different characters, and they're all... Like, that's the whole thing in Pirates of the Caribbean, where they're all, like, betraying and making deals with each other, and you can't quite keep straight, like, who owed who, and who was promised, and what is happening. That's kind of, like, part of the fun of Pirates of the Caribbean, so I didn't feel like mapping that out. That seemed like a lot. So this is just the first movie. And if I had to try and boil down what that movie is about, I would say it's about debts. And that's not quite right, and I think that's because they didn't outline the conflict and the values well enough for me to be able to like say, yes, this is what that movie is about. But I think Debts probably comes the closest, and that's a really good stab for the writers at a pirate movie. You'd think about some of the inherent conflicts and values with pirate movies, and to me, Debts would definitely be one of the front runners there. It's even in that kind of idea of the code. It's like pirates, we have our own code and our own system of honor, and that's how I think it connects to Debts, and you see kind of different arguments around that. But to break this down, I think that the values at play with the characters are mostly freedom versus obligation. This is a stretch, guys. I had to stretch to kind of get this, so bear with me, and you can tell me if you think about the movie, if you see something different. But freedom versus obligation, the positive expression of freedom, I would say, is Will and Elizabeth. And these were the characters that I was like, okay, Will and Elizabeth actually don't spend a lot of screen time together. Should they actually operate as different values? Like, they would make up a 5 instead of 4. But in the first movie, they don't really have different values from each other. They want the same thing. They want the freedom to love each other and to be together and to pursue their adventures and their dreams together. There's the freedom to pursue what they want to pursue is kind of the idea. And I think really it's adventure is the thing that bonds the characters together. They want to pursue adventure and be free to pursue adventure, and whether that be the adventure of a romance between them or the adventure of being pirates, that's what kind of draws them together. On the negative value of freedom, I would put Jack, and this is definitely there in the movie because he has that whole great speech on the beach by the fire where he's like, oh, a ship isn't just a rudder and a wheel and a mast and sails. That's what a ship is made of. But what a ship is freedom. And that's what he actually values, and why he is a pirate and is who he is, because he values his personal freedom and the ability to do whatever he wants to do. Now, it's going to put him in conflict with Will and Elizabeth at times, and in purpose together with Will and Elizabeth at times, because he wants to do whatever he wants to do, but they value the freedom to pursue adventure. Their freedom is actually in purpose of something. And so if he wants to do something that's in conflict with their purpose, they're going to have conflict. All right. On obligation, the positive expression of this is Norrington, and all the soldiers and Governor Swan kind of all fall into that camp as well, right? They're the law and order, and I think that you could express Norrington's character completely as he does not want to do. Like, he spends most of the movie just like suffering and doing things he does really not want to do. But he has that sense of obligation to the law and to the social order and morality, and he is not free, right? He is not free. And that's how I would connect him to Barbossa, is Barbossa is not free. And this is where I think it got a little tricky trying to connect the values together. Barbossa wants to be free, and so in a way he does value freedom. But his character is that he's trapped, and he is trapped because of his own greed. The greed of the treasure, obviously, but also the greed of mutinying against Jack and becoming the captain, and then falling into this curse where he can never die. And so he wants to be free of his obligations. I guess that's why I would put him as the negative of obligation. He will do anything to be free of obligation, and that's a negative expression of obligation, I guess I would say. Is if the obligation is not voluntary, then it is a problem, it is a sin, it is a net negative in the world if you are not voluntarily taking up your obligations. So again, you could probably put the positive and negative as kind of altruistic versus selfish, or maybe purpose versus selfish. We don't just want freedom for freedom's sake. We want the freedom to pursue our purpose. and pursue adventure, which is an admirable admirable trait. In narrative terms, the desire and the freedom to pursue adventure is very, very valuable in narrative terms. Anyway, so it's a little sketchy. I don't think these characters quite come into the fullness of what this could have been when you lay it out like this. Like, you don't see a lot of conflict between, like, Barbossa and Norrington necessarily. But this is the best I could do, guys. And I feel like debts really was the heart of that movie. Especially, there's the whole bit with Jack and his one bullet in his pistol. He feels that he owes that one shot to Barbossa, and he is not going to waste it on anyone else. And it's this idea that that bullet is indebted to Barbossa. It's in payment to Barbossa for all of the everything that Barbossa perpetrated against Jack. And that's kind of his purpose, is this idea of debts. And even Elizabeth and Norrington, there's a little bit of debts there, that they make the deal that she will marry him if he goes to rescue Will. And so she becomes indebted to him, right? There's that idea kind of at the center of it. Again, it's a little bit of a stretch, but you guys can tell me what you think. What do you guys think? Do you like this four corner opposition thing? I do. It's a lot of fun. Here, I can transfer over here for a minute so we can chat and read the chats. Now you feel like you should give Azula a hug. I know, that poor girl, but also all of the evil that she perpetrated in the world. I don't feel so bad for her. Oh dear. But I really enjoyed the four corner opposition. It's helps understand how all the characters could connect to each other. And the four corner opposition isn't meant to encompass all the characters, because characters can fall into different archetypes and different positions as well. Like, there's just like a position that John Truby lays out that's just ally. And this is just someone who has the same values as the main character, who's on the same purpose with them. They can offer conflict. You know, they can point out when the main character is doing something wrong or anything like that. But help highlight their weakness, help give them ideas, help them be creative. But their values are not intrinsically in conflict. And so that's why they're not going to be labeled as an opponent. Yeah, it basically guarantees a lot of conflict and a lot of plot around the conflict, because you're not just stuck with protagonist versus antagonist. Yep, love it. When I read Anatomy of Story, I fully embraced four corner opposition. It's great. I love it. All right, I'm going to take a little break real quick and run to the restroom. I will be... Alright, I'm back. The breakdowns are very inspiring, showing a wide variety of relationships starts the creative juices flowing. I know, isn't it cool? I think it's really cool. Alright, shall we keep going? I just have a couple more, and then we're going to move on. Where's my window? Okay. The next one's going to be Gollum from Lord of the Rings. And this is how I figured... Okay, this is specifically for the Two Towers. Same as kind of with a TV show, because there's the different movies. They kind of reconfigure the characters each movie to be in a different four-corner opposition, right? So this was specifically the Two Towers because you guys wanted me to look at Gollum. I really think the Two Towers is Gollum's movie, right? It's the one that he's in the most and has the most influence on this. Well, I don't know about the most influence on the story, but most influence kind of on the conflict. And Lord of the Rings is pretty simple. There's just too many characters for there to be a lot of complexity with the conflict. That would just take too long. And maybe if they were making it a series, they would have the room to really branch out and build conflicts. But I also just think the Lord of the Rings wasn't built for that. My view on Lord of the Rings is that it's not really about internal conflict. It's about the best of what each race had to offer, their best warriors, their best people coming together to defeat ultimate evil. And so it's really not about how to become a hero or how to grow, which is what the hero's journey kind of is. They're already heroes at the start of the beginning. It's how they work together, and it's the conflicts that they meet along the way. And so it's just really not a complexity involved here. But what I found was just sacrifice versus power. Pretty simple. I couldn't really find a label for the positive and negative. And I think this one is pretty easy to see. Frodo obviously is sacrificing himself in carrying the ring, and he fully really doesn't expect to ever come back, and it's going to destroy him to do this, and he kind of knows that and is realizing that. And I think Galadriel even has that line in the Two Towers, that he's realizing that the quest will claim his life, I believe is the line. It's gonna take everything. Then Faramir is the positive expression of power. He is tempted to take the ring because he wants to use the power for good. He wants to defeat Sauron with it. He wants to defend his city with it. It's the temptation of power for good that's at stake and puts them into conflict. Because Frodo says, no, we have to sacrifice the power. That's the way we defeat the villain. And it's very counterintuitive to a warrior like Faramir. Obviously, Saruman is the negative expression of power. Power. All the power to power whatever I want power. Sauron. And then Gollum, I saw that he was the negative expression of sacrifice because what he is that he sacrificed all the wrong things. And, you know, that's even how his story starts, is that he sacrifices the life of his friend. And he sacrificed his health and his, I hate to say humanness because he wasn't a human, but his humanness and his natural life, I guess is maybe what you could call it. He sacrificed his natural life for the ring, and this is where it's led him. And even his conflict throughout the film is about, well, what do I sacrifice? Do I sacrifice Gollum? And there's that great scene where he tells Gollum, go away, and never come back. Do I sacrifice Gollum or do I sacrifice Frodo? Because they cannot exist. They cannot both exist as my master, right? And so that's the question at stake for Gollum is, sacrifice. Who do I sacrifice? And ultimately, he does not choose well. And that's why The Two Towers ends where it does. If the book The Two Towers doesn't end where the movie The Two Towers ends, it ends much later. Like Shelob is in The Two Towers in the books, but I can see why they decided to end the story where they decided to end it, because that's where Gollum decides that he's gonna sacrifice Frodo, and Gollum wins. And that conflict is really what drives a lot of Frodo's plot line in The Two Towers. It's also this conflict as well drives the active plot in The Two Towers. This is like plot A, and then plot B for Frodo is the interaction between these three characters. And Sauron's just always there, present and evil as the ring. Alright, last one. I forgot to put this guy on the polls, but I wanted to look at who is considered to be one of the greatest villains of all time. The Joker. You know it. So I wanted to take a look at this because Nolan is amazing at four corner opposition and building the plot and the structure around it and the characters around it. He's brilliant at this, and it's we'll get into some more of why the Joker works so well later, but this, I think really what might be at the heart of it is he has an ability to envision interesting conflicts and not rehash ground that we've already rehashed. We've already hashed the superhero ground. And maybe not. No, yeah, we had, even like back when Batman Begins came out, Batman Begins kind of sparked this new revival of superheroes. But before that, superheroes were in, popular culture. There's all the Batman movies, all of the Superman movies, and Flash, like all the old 70s, 80s movies, superhero movies. Nolan really kickstarted the new revival of superhero movies and the serious tone and the ability to tackle more serious conflicts. And so, anyway, part of what I think makes the Joker and the Dark Knight work so well is that he chose a very interesting conflict. And I think it's I'm just going to lay this out and then talk about it. I think the conflict is justice and anti-justice was kind of his central idea, which works really well. In the genres book, he says that the detective genre fundamentally is about justice. That's kind of what it's about. And so making that the center of a Batman movie makes a lot of sense and brings the old idea of Batman as the world's greatest detective into the story without doing a lot of cliche detective things. But basically how I laid out the characters is, interestingly enough, I did not see Bruce as the positive expression of value 1. I thought that was Harvey Dent. And that's part of, again, what makes it interesting is because we don't have our protagonist in the usual spot. Kind of switch things around. And I think it's because Harvey Dent is the expression of the external conflict. And we obviously see that come to fruition with Two-Face and all of the imagery that's associated with conflict. And Two-Face, that's a little bit obvious, but he's the expression of the external conflict. The idea of justice, the system of justice, what justice is, justice towards other people, justice in the society at large. Whereas I think Bruce is more about personal justice, real justice. And that's the conflict that exists between them, and why Bruce operates outside the system is, as Batman, is because he didn't feel like real justice was being pursued by the system in the first movie. And in Harvey Dent we see the hope, right, that the system will actually be able to function as a system of justice, and that's the hope. But the idea of justice is very personal, it's very internalized for Bruce, and throughout the story he's not like sitting there asking, is this the just thing to do? How do we mete out justice on these criminals? It's very what feels just in the moment, and what feels just overall, and not necessarily just parsing each situation apart. Anyway, that's, and it's what puts these two characters at odds, and as they're both opponents and allies at times throughout the story, because they do want the same thing, they want justice, but how they pursue it is different. And then the negative expression is anti-justice, and this, I think, is again one of the most interesting choices that you could make. Instead of the opposite of justice, which might be like mercy or something like that, Nolan kind of went, what about a character who doesn't believe justice is real? He doesn't believe that justice exists. And so that's what the Joker is, and why it works so well as the Joker, right? Justice is a joke that we all participate in for some reason, and I'm gonna show you how it's a joke and laugh at it. Like, that's the Joker. It's the over in the other corner, we can talk real quick. This is Maroni. He's the mob boss, and there's also just all the other criminals, and there's that I don't remember his name, and there's a Chinese businessman who is laundering all of the money for the mob, and Bruce goes to China and breaks into his skyscraper, and there's a really cool action sequence and all of that. These guys kind of represent the typical villains. They want to escape justice, right? And I put them inside the system because they're not really, they want to escape the justice system, right? They're not really interested in the law, but they are interested in justice and in how they define it. So there's the scene where the Joker comes in and burns all their money. I guess I should back up. So the Joker, why he works so well is he is anti-justice, but he understands that everybody else operates off of justice, and he uses that fact against them. And it's why he seems so unpredictable and crazy and yet coherent. You know, it's not like he just reacts to things and does crazy things. He actually has a reason that he's doing things. And so when he is in cahoots with the mob and he saves all their money and then he just burns it, right? He's messing with their sense of justice, that they worked and they overcame, they outsmarted the cops and Batman, and they managed to get their money, but then it just burns in front of them, and it completely messes with their sense of justice and their sense of the code, I guess, going back to debts and the code and all of that. But that honor among thieves, I guess, is an idea that exists in a mob, at least that you're loyal to your own mob. And so Maroni thinks that he's made a deal with the Joker and that they have some loyalty and some honor between each other, and then the Joker just goes and burns the money and shows, haha, it's all just a big joke, none of it matters, that sort of thing. But I think the biggest joke that the Joker plays that is anti-justice is definitely on the audience and the characters. It's in the, you know, the scene where Batman rushes off to save Rachel, but Joker told him wrong, and he actually gets to Harvey, and Rachel dies, right? In the fire, and Harvey's face gets half burnt off. The whole thing is messing with Batman's sense of justice, Harvey's sense of justice, the audience's sense of justice, that Batman, when the Joker tells Batman that he can save Harvey or he could save Rachel, Bruce's sense of justice puts Rachel above Harvey, right? He's like, no, she matters more. She is more, whereas if he were looking at that objectively, Harvey would probably come first as the icon for the society, as the white knight, as this politician. In society, Harvey has more value than Rachel. But to Bruce, the just thing would be to go to Rachel because he cares about her and because she's more vulnerable. And again, it's that idea of personal justice. He's not looking at, justice in the society. He's looking at, what do people deserve? Maybe that's a better way to put it. Bruce is looking at, what do I deserve? What do people deserve? And Rachel deserves to be saved more than Harvey does in Bruce's books. And so he rushes off to save her. But the Joker knew that, and he plays with that sense of justice. And it's playing with the audience's narrative sense of justice, because the game that has been set up is if Batman could get there in time, right? That's the game that we're used to. And as the audience, we want it to be a fair competition in which our hero has a chance of winning. But that's not the game that Joker set up. It's playing with our sense of justice. And it completely breaks Harvey's mind, right? And that's the whole point of the Joker, is to prove that justice is just a joke. It's a game. We're all playing together for some reason, and I want to make you guys see it. And obviously the ending with the two ships and the criminals and the passengers holding the two buttons. Again, the question is about, what do people deserve? And so everyone is like, well, those criminals do not deserve to live if these innocent passengers die. Right? That's you're like, but that doesn't mean that it's okay. They don't deserve to die either. And the Joker sets up this false either or, trying to prove his point. But in the end, I haven't thought about that. In the end, what wins out exactly? In the end, each group has to decide what would be just for the other group. And so in the end, it actually is Bruce's philosophy that wins out. It's not the passengers have to decide that the prisoners do not deserve to die. And the prisoners have to decide that the passengers do not deserve to die. They're not looking at the system of justice and who deserves to live more and who deserves what punishment. They're just looking at what feels just in this moment, what is just for me and my actions and my behavior, right? And so that it actually Bruce's beliefs that win out in the end in that place against the Joker. And again, Nolan is brilliant at plot, he's brilliant at this, and so he does a whole reversal thing where once the Joker is neutralized, Harvey actually moves into the Joker's values, right? He no longer believes in justice, he believes in chance. He flips the coin to see if you're going to live or if you're going to die. Justice isn't real, it's just all a chance game. And he's gone kind of crazy, same as the Joker. And so the quandary again that is put before Bruce once that situation is diffused is how to put this, because it almost seems like Bruce, the quandary is what I'm thinking of the end speech actually, where what's his face, Commissioner Gordon says, like, oh, Batman isn't the hero we need, he's the hero we deserve. Again, it's the question of deserve and justice and all of that. Basically, the decision there is that society deserves to have hope, right? And when he decides to conceal what happened with Harvey and make himself the villain in society's eyes, he decides society deserves to have hope. And that's why it's tripping me up, because in some ways he's kind of moved over into Harvey's position of thinking about the system and what the people in the system deserve. But no, actually, I think he does remain where he is, because basically that's the whole thing. It's not the hero they need, it's the hero they deserve. Oh, now I'm getting caught up in the... I don't know. What do you guys think? What do you guys think of this? It's so convoluted and complicated with Nolan that sometimes it's like, what? They moved, what? Who is what? But I had a thought. Let me see if I can recapture it. It's not the hero they... Is the line the hero they need? Or is that line the hero they want? Now I'm wondering about the line. But anyway, I could get caught on that for quite some time. But this idea of deserve, what do people deserve? And Bruce's... And maybe we should change this. Maybe instead of outside the system and inside the system, it should be like the law and then what people actually deserve. Maybe that would be a better breakdown of the values. Because that's what the Joker is about. People deserve who they are and what they reap. And if you give them choices, they will make the wrong ones. I don't know. Maybe I should probably get off this. I could stay on this for a long time. Anyway, that's why the Joker works so dang well, is because he isn't a portrayal of the typical justice versus mercy or justice versus power. I don't even know what the opposite would be typically. He's anti-justice. But he understands justice, and he thinks it's fake. And so he just plays with everybody, and it's awesome as a character. Alright, so I think that's going to be kind of it for Four Corner Opposition for now. We can come back to looking at the formula for a villain. Formula. Megan says, I think that characters moving isn't a bad thing. In fact, change is part of the story. So sometimes the Four Corner Opposition setup is one way, but halfway through. Yeah, I totally agree that they can move around as the characters arc and stuff. I was just trying to figure out how exactly they moved and what the equation is, as usual. What the equation is. Isn't it another way to say order versus chaos? Instead of justice versus anti-justice? I just think that justice is more specific. It's not just any order. It's actually the belief that to have order, it must be just. You have to mete out justice. People must get what they deserve in order for order to happen. So maybe chaos is a better way of explaining the Joker. But I still think that he's not random. And when you think of chaos, you think of randomness. And just something happens and then something else happens and they're unconnected and none of it matters. And he thinks that... See, if he thought that nothing mattered, he would be nihilistic and depressed. You know? It's not that he thinks that nothing matters. He actually thinks that his cause matters, or he wouldn't put so much work into it. He thinks that everybody else is living a joke. Uh-oh. There went the camera. Okay. Let me see what I can do with that. see how long this lasts. We might have to start doing some stuff about the camera, give it a little break. Okay, but anyway, I don't think that Joker is chaos. I think he's anti-justice, which sometimes manifests the same, but it's not quite the same. It's more specific. But we're going to talk about going back to the formula. So we've talked about you got to create a great hero with a great conflict. And then four corner opposition is kind of covering. You have to understand your antagonist's function within the story and his relationship with the hero using the context of the theme and the moral argument. So it's not just that he's connected in some way. It's actually within the context of the conflict and what the story is about. Last bit in the formula is to build the character's motivation and backstory. And this is creating, like, once you've built the context of the battleground, what are we fighting over? What's at play here? What is the moral argument? We get to do the fun part, which I think is what we all like with creating characters, and that's making the antagonist a human. Building a human and then messing them up is how Abby Emmons talks about it. So four corner opposition will make sure that your character is relevant to the story, and talking back to that quote from John Truby about the necessary villain and putting necessary pressure on the character. That's what four corner opposition will do. It will create that necessity and make sure that you're operating that way. But it's the process of fleshing out the character and building something that's where the real creativity comes into it, and where your characters can become iconic and individual. And this is where the artistry and the fun and the creativity is for us as writers. So to give a little bit of structure to that, you can simply build the character the same way that you would the protagonist. Remember, we were looking at this earlier on. These are actually the pieces of the character that build the plot and the character at the same time. You just change it a little bit for the opponent. Obviously, we don't need the opponent category. If you've already built your protagonist and you've built out your four corner opposition, you know who the opponents are already. You're not going to have to build that. But a protagonist should have his own weakness and need, his own desire line, his own plan to get what he wants. And battle, you probably don't have to flesh out as well, but when you look at the battle from the antagonist's perspective, you're probably going to become more informed on what the battle should be and how the protagonist and the antagonist are going to actually come into conflict together and battle out these values. Self-revelation is an optional point, and this is some of what you were talking about, Megan, where characters can change. They can change, but it's not random. They actually have to have some sort of self-realization. And in the case of Harvey Dent, right, he has a negative self-realization. He actually is like, you know what? Justice doesn't exist. It's all just a flip of the coin. It's all, he actually, that is his character arc. He does have a self-revelation. So John Truby calls this a double reversal. An advanced technique for showing character change in a story is a unique kind of self-revelation that I call the double reversal. In this technique, you give the opponent as well as the hero a self-revelation. Each learns from the other, and the audience receives two insights about how to act and live in the world instead of one. And so Harvey Dent's a negative example, but a positive example would be like Zuko, and how I talked about how Zuko, through the seasons, he moves in and out of the opponent ring, or he moves into different opponent rings. So in season 3, he's more of a putting pressure on Aang in his personal conflicts and not necessarily the context of the worldwide conflict. Aang knows what he kind of needs to do. It's just about how do I get there and all that. And Zuko puts pressure on him to grow in that way. And probably the best episode for that, it would be the one with the dragons and the Dance of the Dragons, or whatever that episode is called. But Zuko goes through this whole journey, and he has his own self-revelation. And through Aang, we're learning about responsibility and how to take responsibility for things. And through Zuko, we kind of see that struggle with trying to reconcile your beliefs, really, is he believed all these things and they have to change, and he has to go through this long struggle of how to do that. And so that is the model of living to insight, a second insight on top of Aang's insights on how to be a good person and how to act and live in the world. We get a second one through Zuko's arc. So going back to Gollum as well, this double reversal idea is one of the reasons that Gollum becomes so compelling and interesting as a character. It's because it's like a setup for a double reversal. And we want to believe that there's hope for Gollum. We really, really want to believe that. We want him to have that self-revelation moment and be free of the ring and be free of Gollum. Smeagol, be free of Gollum. And that's what creates like the tension and the suspense of that whole plot line, because if his inner conflict is resolved in favor of Gollum instead of in favor of Smeagol, obviously it would have devastating effects on Frodo's quest and how will he get through Mordor and blah 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 blah, the plot. But more than that, like, Gollum is a projection of what could happen to Frodo. And so we desperately, desperately want there to be hope for Smeagol, because we want there to be hope for Frodo. And that's what makes him so compelling, is this setup that he's gonna have a self-revelation, that he's gonna get there. And when that happens, we would have so much hope for Frodo, but it doesn't. And we are devastated by it, right? So, in both of those examples, Zuko and Gollum, it's not the antagonist who's given the self-revelation, it's the other opponent, right? It's not the main guy. And I really have trouble imagining a scenario where you could have a self-revelation with the main opponent, if that makes sense. Especially if he's a villain. That would seem like so much work. And I think maybe Black Panther took a stab at that, and I don't think it really worked very well. It's very difficult to do. So if you're planning on doing some sort of double reversal, it would work better with one of these other opponents. That's what I think. So, all your opponents, especially your antagonist, need to have their own desire line, and what they desire needs to be in conflict with the hero's desire and within the context of the moral argument of the central conflict. Again, there was that quote earlier about it's not just that the hero and the villain want different things, it's that they want the same thing, or that their desires are in competition with the other. They both cannot exist at the same time. And so getting that desire line has to do with the values and building the conflict in the four corner opposition. And so once you have that in place, the next part is motivation and backstory, which is why do they desire what they desire and how did they get that way. If you guys want a cool video about this, I would watch Abby Emmons' video about creating villains, because it's just about, yeah, that's what she says. It's like you build a person and then you figure out what went wrong in that person, right? And she gives examples. So if you want to flesh that idea out a little bit more, you can watch her video because she gives examples. So, in thinking about motivation and backstory, what are the hurts and wounds and suffering that your antagonist has endured? What were the weaknesses and misbeliefs that they had? Again, that weakness and need beat in the building a character key. And the purpose of this is not to excuse the evilness of the character, nor is it to cause the audience to have sympathy or for them to like the villain. That's not the purpose of building backstory around hurts and wounds and suffering and misbeliefs. The point is that, like, taking a step out of story and into the real world, evil is shaped and created. It doesn't just come out of nowhere. And it's somewhat the belief that if the viewer had lived, if the audience, what we're showing the audience with the villain isn't, oh, you should like him, or, oh, he had some good points. It's if you had lived the life that they had lived, you would be no different. And that is empathy, that you actually understand where they're coming from. Not that you think it's right, or that you excuse the immoral actions that the character is taking, but you understand. You have empathy. In that empathy, again, this is the value that we're offering the audience through this, is that we realize our own capacity for sin. Because why would we be able to empathize with a villain except for that we have darkness and evilness inside of us, that same capacity for evil, if circumstances had been different, if we had been hurt and wounded the way that the villain is hurt. And so I think in a lot of cases, this is something that writers are still learning. Writers that are still learning are kind of ignorant about. And it's one of the reasons why we have so many one-dimensional villains who don't do anything but provide some obstacles for the hero. I think that's one reason, is just that people don't think about this and realize exactly what the purpose of all of this is in the story. But I think also it can be an act of intellectual cowardice and laziness that professional writers don't really have an excuse for. If you understand the purpose of story, if you know what stories are about and why we have them and the value that they offer to audience, it's cowardly and lazy not to do this work with your villain, to understand the why and the how, that what created them. It's the point of storytelling, of this art form, to help people gain understanding of human nature, of our own nature. And people who can't be honest don't make great writers, and they don't produce good work. And I think we have a lot of that going on in Hollywood and industry. And I don't want to chalk it all up to, I think a lot of people just aren't trained, and they don't know, and they haven't delved deeply enough into storytelling to know that this is actually the point. If you're unwilling to go on the adventure of examining your own heart and soul and being honest about what you find there, then what is the value that you're bringing to the table? It's just entertainment. That's all it will be. And that's why we see a whole bunch of generic ideas of what evil is, and they just kind of copy paste evil villain onto all the other evil villains, and they all kind of look the same, and they all offer the same thing, which is just obstacle to the protagonist. And so, in being honest, examining your own heart and your own soul and what is actually there, again, I was talking about how your unique perspective on these conflicts, your unique idea of conflict and your own perspective on conflicts is the value that you bring. And so you have to actually make the evilness your own capacity for villainy. Like, that's where the most compelling writing is going to come out of. You have experiences that no one else has, and you have a perspective that no one else has, and figuring out how to honestly transfer that to the page is what is going to be compelling to people. And so it takes a lot of courage to do that, and that's why I'm calling it intellectual cowardice, that writers are allowed to get away with not doing that, and that it's perpetrated by studios and by producers who are looking for products, and they're not necessarily looking at artistry. And there's a balance there that you have to get, because industry, but what the studios have set the standard for, because they do set the standards, is just entertaining. This needs to be entertaining. This needs to hold my attention, and that's about the extent of the standards. And I guess I'm raising a standard for you guys on, it doesn't need to just be entertaining. It needs to be meaningful, and it needs to be of value, in that you are giving your audience a real look at the human capacity for sin, and the human capacity, your own capacity for sin. And that's not a comfortable thing to do. But it has to be kind of, that is the adventure of writing, and it kind of has to be approached with courage and the desire to pursue truth. I have a whole essay coming out about pursuing truth, but it's going to be a topic that I have a lot to say about. But the truth is, this is why people don't connect, people don't like villains that are just evil for evil's sake, and why they feel flat and one-dimensional. It's that the truth is that evil doesn't just exist somewhere out in the world. Evil people just aren't born. And so it's actually a form of untruth when we portray villainy that way. And people can sense it and they know it because they've actually probably experienced selfishness and anger and hate and, you know, all the things in their life. And so they see a more ha 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 villain and they're like, well, that's not real. That's not a real conflict or a real challenge to overcome. So this is why I like Abby's way of describing villains, is that first you have to create a person and then you have to explain what went wrong, because villainy is actually unnatural. How would I say that? It's not the state in which we are meant to be. And so something has to go wrong for it to happen. It doesn't just happen all by itself. It's just a natural part of the world that evil is floating out there in the ether and it manifests as people. It's just really not how it works. A lazy or an inexperienced writer, and a lot of this is inexperience, a lot of this is it's complicated and it's difficult and it's scary to figure out. They can ignore that reality, but the cost is going to be stories that don't mean anything and stories that are one-dimensional and have one-dimensional villains. So it's like, if you want to have compelling villains, if you want to have compelling conflicts, you're going to have to do the self-research into your own heart and your own soul and find what's there. That's how it's going to work. And just kind of showing this, I was thinking about Avatar, and I know you guys all said Azula from Avatar, but I was realizing how many great villains there are in Avatar, because there's comparatively a lot. There's not a lot of villains that just fall completely flat in Avatar. They all are there went my camera again, guys. There's some really good villains that really stand out because they are frightening, and they're not the same kind of frightening. They're all different from each other, and they all provide different pressure on each other, or on our protagonists. And what's scary, I'm gonna let the camera shut off for a minute and cool down. That's why I'm sorry, guys. I'm gonna be paused. But what's scary isn't that they're powerful. That's not the scary part, because Ozai is probably the most powerful character in the show, and he's not as scary as the others. What makes them scary is because we actually understand how they got to where they are. And they justify the harm they do to others with their own suffering and their own desires. And so it's when we empathize with them, and that's how they build these characters too. Zhao less so, because he's just a major villain for Zuko. And he's there to provide empathy for Zuko. But we can still see parts of ourselves in Zhao and how dedicated he is and how much ambition he has to change the world. Not in good ways, but with Longfang and what's her name? Is it Hama? The Bloodbender lady. They work first to explain who these characters are. And why they're doing what they're doing, and then they show how what they're doing is evil and bad, and how they've gone down the wrong path in pursuit of these things. In Longfang's case, it's control, and Hama's is revenge. We actually empathize with it, and that makes it scary, because then they're revealed to be these evil people, and you're like, ah! Ooh. It's been said that you can't be good until you know how close you are to evil. Yeah. My husband calls that cotton candy entertainment, no substance. Yeah. So true. In my book, my main protagonist is on the edge of becoming a villain. I think as a society we have less empathy for people when we judge others as good and bad. Right. But everyone has a propensity to be a villain. No one is righteous, not one. Yeah. Right. Right. Good insights, you guys. Yeah. So, anyway, I'm just taking apart the pieces. It's not that they just need to have a compelling backstory. It's actually what the backstory says about how they got where they are and how it needs to tug on our own inner villainy. And their motivation also has to be something that we experience and is part of the human condition. And so we have to be honest about what we actually experience ourselves as writers. All right, here's a quote from the book on this. By giving the hero and the opponent similarities, you also keep the hero from being perfectly good and the opponent from being completely evil. Never think that the hero and the opponent as never think of the hero and opponent as complete opposites. Rather, they are two possibilities within a range of possibilities. The argument between hero and opponent is not between good and evil, but between two characters who have weaknesses and needs. We're going to look at a couple more examples. Some of these we already looked at, but I'm going to go into them a little bit more. So here's Hopper. And Hopper, again, his value was control and order and sustaining the order that he has built, right? Because he's got a good... They come in, they frighten the ants a little bit, and then they get to eat all the food, and they don't have to work. And it makes him very popular as a leader. All the other people will follow him. So his position as a leader and get to be at the top of the food chain here is at stake if the system fails. If the system is broken, his position, his identity is at stake. But if they had just kind of stuck with that, he would have probably come across as quite cartoonish. He's just kind of there. You have to do what I say, and blah, 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 blah. They have to do what I say. They actually do a lot of work with Hopper to make him very consistent internally, and there's some surprising things there. It's not just his position as the leader and his place in the world that is at stake. It's, like I said, it's his identity, and he is terrified that if anything slips out of control, he will lose control entirely. And so he controls the ants, he controls his brother, he controls the other grasshoppers. Everything he does is to keep this tightly held control. It's his inward security that's at stake. And it's this fear. The motivation for that is this fear of becoming prey. And he cannot stand it. He cannot stand it. He's actually extremely anxious. He has an anxiety disorder. But he cannot handle chaos in any way. And that includes chaos within his own understanding of the world. I'll get into that. But so there's not like a full backstory for Hopper that explains how he came to be the way that he is, but one story that they give for that just kind of illuminates this part of his personality is his brother says, oh yeah, there's that one time he's scared of birds because there was that one time that bird caught you and scratched your eye, remember that? And like Hopper nails him to the wall and was like, shut up, don't talk about that. Again, a good demonstration of how Hopper has to have control. And his brother is just like chaos. And this little scene tells you so much about Hopper, because he also says that in that same scene that if I hadn't promised our mother on her deathbed that I wouldn't kill you, I would kill you, because his brother is such a force of chaos in his life. He's so tempted to eliminate it, but this is what I mean by the internal consistency of Hopper. He holds to his word. That is the one good thing that you could say about Hopper, that he says what he means and does what he says, because there must be order, and that has to exist for there to be order. He can't just change his mind all the time. He has a lot of conviction that allows him to stay true to his word, and we see that several times throughout the story, that he is the personification of order. He's the ultimate agent of order, I guess might be a way to say that. But anyway, the backstory of getting his eye scratched out of as a bird just informs his fear, right? Because that is the picture of no longer being the top of the food chain, that there's something else out there bigger and stronger that wants to eat him, and he just cannot deal with that reality. And unfortunately that's his end when he gets eaten by the bird at the end. Because he loses control. He loses control of everything. John says, in the end, people have to make choices. For instance, C.S. Lewis and Nietzsche both had abusive childhoods, but in the end chose very different paths. Indeed. Alright. Another example, looking at how to build a character, is Thanos. Thanos was fun to look at because it took me a hot second to try and figure it out. So Thanos' desire is to save the universe from overpopulation. And I'm talking specifically about Infinity War. I kind of have to take the movies isolated to themselves, because that's how structure works within the story. So he wants to save the universe from overpopulation by destroying half of all living things. And so he's seeking the Infinity Stones to have the power to do that. When I dug into how this is constructed in the story, I found that he doesn't actually have a motivation for this. They give you his backstory, which is his home planet was destroyed because of the lack of resources. I don't remember the exact details of if they went to war over the resources and they just ended up all destroying each other, or the whole society just kind of fell apart and crumbled and they used every last drop of the resources until they all died or something. I don't remember the exact story. But that's what happened to him, but it doesn't explain his motivation, because a motivation has to be, I think for a villain, it has to be a fear. It has to be a fear. And maybe it's displayed differently. Maybe it's anger, but anger is based in fear for the most part. Maybe it could be grief, but the real immorality of grief is in fear. That you become self-protecting in fear that you will feel grief again. Or anger comes from grief, and that's how you also an extension. So I guess anger doesn't just come from fear, but one of those three kind of has to be the root of it, but they don't really give us one of the three. It also could be pride. Pride again actually manifests as fear, because it's a fear that your pride will be broken, that you will lose what you have to be proud of. But for instance, if his motivation was grief, then I don't think he would have ended up with the desire that he had. If his motivation was grief, then he would have wanted revenge. And maybe you could say, oh, I want revenge on the universe for the just the inevitability of destruction that the growth of the growth creates. Like, growth can only go so far, and destruction is inevitable. And so he's taking vengeance on the universe for that reality, but they don't set that up. Like, there's no scenes that show that's what he thinks. Or maybe he's just afraid that it'll happen again, but why would he care? Why would he care about all these other planets? Why would he care if the human race destroys itself because of overpopulation and overconsumption? That's not explained. That's not what the backstory doesn't explain, why he's doing what he's doing. And this is the real flaw in Thanos, I think, because he has such conviction. He throws his daughter off a cliff to get one of the Infinity Stones, and he's obviously devastated about it, but we don't ever get a clear explanation of why. Why is he so convicted about this towards the entire universe? And so they use the backstory as the motivation, but they don't actually explain the motivation part. That's some of what's wrong with Infinity War. Another piece of Infinity War is just that there's so many dang characters, and they handled it very, very well. It was very interesting looking at the four-corner opposition of Infinity War, because Thanos is in the positive of value 1. Kind of. I couldn't exactly determine what the values were. Yeah, so maybe that's not a good way to say it. He was obviously the protagonist, though, because all of the other characters are in primary opposition to him. They don't exist in opposition to any of the other characters. They have conflict with each other somewhat, kind of, but there isn't really any values at play here. And so I could just kind of break them up into 3 kind of groups, which was Gamora and the Guardians, which he has to come in conflict with because he needs to kill Gamora to get the thing. And then there's Cap and the defense team, protecting Earth, and then there's Tony and the offense team traveling off of Earth to attack Thanos. And he comes into conflict with all of them, and somewhere in there is Thor. I think that Thor is probably the weakest storyline in Infinity War, and you're just kind of like, why, what? And I couldn't really place him within these categories, so maybe he's his own 5th category. I don't know. But I will say that Infinity War still really works as a movie. If they had just nailed Thanos' motivation, I think that would have fixed whatever problems were left. And I think that it works because it is very fascinating and an interesting twist on the story to treat the villain as the protagonist, and to have the villains or the heroes fail at the end because the protagonist is the villain and he prevails in the end. But it's also, it works because the base conflict that's there is destroy the world or save the world. And that is the fundamental conflict within the action movie genre. If you're going to take the best physical conflict, which really is what the action genre is built off of, this is the largest, grandest, best version of that, is destroy the world or save the world. And so it really creates a fun action movie. It's a really good example, and probably the newest and best example of just a classic action film where you get cool fights between cool characters. There's just not a lot of inner conflict happening. Most of the inner conflict happened in the earlier movie in like Civil War, and it's why Earth cannot mount the defense needed against Thanos. It's because they're so divided because of Civil War and because Thor and blah, all the things. Simplified, comic book Thanos was trying to woo Death herself, so mass murder was him trying to get her attention. So an actual motivation. Wow. That's cool. Okay, so I have a side rant about superhero villains, because it's something that Jordan Peterson said. I love how Jordan Peterson always ends up back in the conversation. But basically what he had to say was, hang on, I'm going to turn on the camera. See if it's cooled down a little bit. Maybe. We'll see. Something that he had to say about superhero villains was that basically they're the new idea of polytheism. This idea of gods and demigods, and even though like the superheroes aren't all gods, Thor is obviously, but they kind of operate as demigods in that idea of enhanced humans. And so they've kind of taken the place in myth and narrative of the old myths about demigods and stuff like that. And I thought that was really interesting to think about from an antagonist perspective, because that works for the heroes, but the antagonists have not taken on the aspect of who they are in those types of myths. In those types of myths, the villains actually stand for archetypes of villainy and archetypes of evil. And some of them even aren't that, but you think of people like, I don't know, Hades or Thanos. Ha ha ha, I know. The god of death, and I think it's kind of why Loki works well, because they did kind of adapt that idea of personification of these negative traits. But the other villains don't really get that treatment, and it's, I think, why a lot of them don't work terribly well. Okay, why is the camera not... I don't know why the camera is not fixing... Hang on a second. Technical difficulties! Like, oh, there's like the sirens or the cyclops, and how these stood for different ideas, and we just don't see that. I think that if you're gonna, it might be a good idea writing a superhero story to take a look at some of those old myths and who the villains in these stories were, and how they were, what exactly archetypically they were capturing and conveying in those stories. Alright, but that's Thanos. Good point, I never thought he doesn't have much motivation. Yeah. But anyway, what you were saying, John, about trying to woo Death herself, that feels like something out of a Greek myth. That feels like they could have made it interesting, but I think they maybe were uncomfortable with that idea for some reason. No idea why Hollywood might be uncomfortable with an idea like that. None. Alright, look at the Joker again, because he's pretty fun. And again, I think the Joker's genius because it's a different twist on some of these ideas, but we don't ever get the Joker's real backstory. Right, he gives the two completely, seemingly real and contradictory backstories. And I was thinking about why Nolan did that, and it made sense to me because if the theme is justice, if the conflict is justice, and he is anti-justice, the backstory is there to justify the motivation. That's why we have the backstory. But for that character, he's not trying to get justice or give people what they deserve or anything like that. Like, his background, in his understanding, I know in reality his background obviously made him who he was. We don't know what it is, but it did. But in his reality, his background had nothing to do with anything. It doesn't inform he's not trying to get justice for anything or give people what they deserve or anything like that. None of it matters. There's no reason for who he is. There's no justice. There's just laughing at everybody else as they scramble around trying to do things that don't matter for people who don't matter. It's like the fact that he has two backstories that both are untrue actually informs a lot about the character. And I thought that was a really interesting choice to do. And I don't know if Nolan thought about all of that or if he had a different reason. Maybe he did just kind of think of chaos, but it feels more specific than chaos. He's like, you know what would be really chaotic? We don't know where he comes from. We don't know what happened to him. That's chaos. But there's his desire, anti-justice, to prove justice is a lie, which is born out of his values, which is born out of the four corner opposition, which is born out of the two values in competition, which is born out of understanding what the basic conflict is, which is born out of the character, if we're looking at the formula. But the motivation, if you can prove the world is insane, then you're not the crazy one. And maybe I'm stretching that a little bit, but I thought it made sense. All right, to kind of finish up on this, here's another quote from the Anatomy of Story. The key to good moral dialogue by the opponent is not to set him up as a straw man, an opponent who appears formidable but is really hollow. Never give your opponent an obviously weak argument. Give him the best, most compelling argument you can. Make sure he's right about some things, but also make sure there is a fatal flaw in his logic. And that's villainy. What do you guys think? Do you have thoughts to add to this? New thoughts you've never thought before? I thought this was a pretty fun exploration. I have kind of one last smaller section here at the end. Oh, it's getting kind of late. But about, I just had a few thoughts as a Christian writer coming off of this, and I think John Truby's way of looking at story is very much in line with a Christian perspective. And so I just want to kind of connect a couple of those thoughts a little bit. But if I wanted to hear if you guys had any thoughts first. Annie, this was some very well planned. You made some great points. Oh, thank you. Examples. Oh, good. I'm glad it's going as well as it is. I was working at the last moment like, oh, I should probably have some examples and trying to get the diagrams together and analyze it and parse it all out for myself. It definitely, I think, makes me think a little bit harder about what stories are actually about and what are core conflicts to the human experience, and how do you make stories actually about that. And that's the fun part, right? That's the creativity, is your own creative perspective on the conflicts and then building the characters in unexpected and unique ways. I'm looking forward to the day when I tackle a story with an actual villain in it, because the future I'm writing right now does not have a villain in it either. Par for the course of the genre. It's a coming of age. I would label it mostly as a coming of age, but it's not about a teenager, if that makes sense. If I'm pulling one of the genres out of here, it's like a combination between coming of age and romance, but the romance isn't between a guy and a girl. It's between a mom and a daughter, and not literal romance, but about a relationship between a mom and a daughter with the structure of a romance. It's so fun to analyze story and conflicting characters, and I truly feel sorry for people who have no idea how to do that or want to. Yeah. Well, I think people want to create compelling villains, and they have a lot of fun coming up with evil versions of characters and thinking about all the evil things, but there's an aspect of fantasy to that I was trying to come against, and maybe I thought this and didn't write it. I see this most in some of the, I guess this is what I mean by being honest. There is a tendency toward, when building a villain, yeah, we're bringing things out of our own experience and our own kind of villainy, but there's a tendency to feel like it's our own vindication about those feelings. Like, oh, it's so fun to let out all my anger and my frustration or something else through this character. But what ends up coming across as the character is that they are justified in those feelings, if that makes sense, unless you do the work to look at it very, very honestly, and you see in yourself where those feelings and ideas are coming from. Then are you actually being honest, or are you just kind of living out a fantasy version where you get to let out some of those emotions that normally you wouldn't be able to engage with, I guess. The examinations and examples were the most useful to me. My brother told me about foreground opposition a while ago, but having another perspective on good character opposition is very useful. Yeah, I love foreground opposition, in case you can't tell. I've used it so much in the feature that I'm writing because I have the main character's four corner opposition, but two of the characters on her four corner opposition also have their own four corner oppositions. One of them has two four corner oppositions at that, and so it's very interesting to work with. It really helped me actually structure out. If you have not seen Just Right's video about Batman Begins, where he goes into four corner opposition, he explains how Nolan uses four corner opposition to build plot structure and act structure. That made a lot of sense to me, and that informed a lot of what I'm doing in the feature, because I'll have this kind of just blob of ideas. I'm like, I don't know where to start or how to lay these out, but then I'll lay them out as characters and be like, oh, okay, I see the order that they go in. I understand the structure that's happening now. Megan says, I had a character who is a guy who likes to hurt people. He loves to have power over people. Backstory-wise, I asked myself, how would I become to that? Is it taught or born with? Is it fueled or choice? Right. When I know my enemy, I love him, and that is the moment I kill him. Right? From Ender's Game. Right. Yeah. Yeah. So I guess this the warning to younger writers is don't fall into the fantasy. Like, you want to be honest. Because that's what's compelling. And also because you should be honest. Alright, a few thoughts for Christian writers. The long and short of it is that villains are difficult. They're complex. They have to fulfill a lot of functions. If you don't understand where they are in the story, then it can kind of feel like trying to jam a square peg into a round hole in your story. Like, oh, this is a great idea for a villain, but I'm trying to make it match with the story, but it just doesn't work. It's complex. And even Hollywood does not have a high success rate. So I don't want to feel like I'm coming down too hard on the Christian film industry, but Christians really, really suck at antagonists. And I was struggling with, like, why is that? And it's one of the reasons why Christian movies are so cheesy. I think there's a lot of reasons for that. What I have to say isn't the only one that it's happening, but I think first of all, you have to be a mature writer, and there's just not enough money in the film industry, the Christian film industry, to support a lot of writers to the point of maturity. It takes a long time to be making quality work as a writer. I don't even feel like I'm there yet, and I've been writing for 10 years. So that's part of the problem. But I think, as we've been talking about, you have to have some insight into morality, into psychology, and how people work, and how humans work, and all of that to even start approaching the idea of coming up with an original, frightening villain. You have to have insight. But a few thoughts, and I haven't thought these through all the way, so I'd appreciate hearing your guys' thoughts about this too. But I think one of the main reasons that Christians especially suck at antagonists in Christian media, I think this goes for novels as well as films, is Christians tend to view things in very black and white. And I think, Megan, you've kind of already touched on that. If you divide into camps of good and evil, right? There's just not a lot of room for nuance and complexity there. But I thought about this because I don't think it's a bad thing necessarily. It's just bad in art. So we, as Christians, we like our lines clearly defined. This is sin. That is not. This is good. That is not. This is a temptation. That is not. We need our lines clearly defined when it comes to morals and knowing how to act and behave. And when it comes to morals, you don't want to be fuzzy. You don't want fudgy morals. Jesus didn't ever say, I kind of think this is a good idea, or this might be okay in some circles. It's like, didn't talk that way. It was this or that. Here's the principles. Here's the truth. So when I'm critiquing Christians on looking at the world through a black and white lens, I'm not advocating for fudgy morals. Not interested in that. I don't think the underlying truths of your narrative should be gray or confusing, or you know that thing that artists do where it's like, well, you just get to make your own interpretation of it. It's what you saw in the story. It's like, I don't believe that. Truth is truth, wrong is wrong. You do need to know what the underpinning truth and moral story is that you're telling, and it shouldn't be, I guess, nuance and complexity are not the same thing as confusion and fudging the lines, okay? But where black and white thinking gets in the way of creating antagonists is it's difficult to want to see things from somebody else's point of view, right? If you paint yourself in the good category, it's the only other option is complete evil, and why would you want to empathize with that or legitimize it by doing everything we've been talking about this whole time, steel manning your antagonist's argument and making them a whole multifaceted person who's dealing with the circumstances of their life the best with the tools that they were given by their life. And so it's difficult to want to do that when you see the world in black and white. Megan says, I think the reason why Christians suck at making villains is because of our own self-righteousness. Yup, not always, but I can see that being a stumbling block. You have to have discernment. Right. A good example of this, to me, is the professor character from The God's Not Dead. I really could not stand that movie. It's very... because I just think that character was a straw man in a lot of ways, and the way that you would have gotten over that is it extremely uncomfortable as a Christian to think about, right? It's uncomfortable for a Christian. It feels sacrilegious. I don't think it is, but it feels sacrilegious to think about what are the best arguments for atheism. What are the actual best arguments for atheism? What are the hard questions that even the best Christian theologians and scholars have a hard time coming up with good answers for? Right, you'd have to travel down that path to make that villain actually compelling. And I also would have, instead of making him very overbearing, and he's kind of a bully, and I don't know, his whole he's just kind of angry and towards everyone, not just our main character, but I would have changed that to create a character whose intellectual knowledge and his persuasive rhetoric would have made him extremely charismatic, right? And I think that Christians have a hard time with that idea, that you're presenting the other side as charismatic, and I can hear it now. Oh, but what if that would be a stumbling block to people? What if people watching this movie thought atheism was a good idea? Right? But he would have presented a very different antagonist, and a much more powerful one, to the protagonist, who was this kind of awkward and inexperienced kid. And the conflict that was set up was over who could win over the rest of the class. And so you make the professor this extremely charismatic, intellectual character. Oh, suddenly that's a giant that this awkward, inexperienced kid has to tackle, and not just this grumpy old guy, you know? But no, we wouldn't want to show the atheist having any positive traits or any good arguments. And I don't just mean we wouldn't want the story to make any good arguments for atheism, and I'm not just talking about the intellectual arguments that are part of it, but that antagonist would have put way more pressure on the protagonist's weaknesses, right? And it would have caused the protagonist to have to grow more. So the point of your antagonist isn't so that the audience will think, oh, maybe they had some good points, or maybe we should consider all the sides and compromise more and fudge our morals. The point is that a truth that stands up to a compelling untruth is stronger than the truth that has to stand up to a weak untruth. The truth that has to stand up, the truth that has to defeat a compelling untruth is stronger I'm really trying to get this all in one like line. The truth that has to defeat a compelling untruth is stronger than the truth that goes up against a weak untruth. That's the point. I think we are afraid of philosophy will trump biblical truth to some people, therefore we make bad guys, have no motivation, no good argument. It's fear-based. Yeah, it's fear-based. But I was reading about this, and would you looky there. No testing has overtaken you that is not common to everyone. God is faithful, and he will not let you be tested beyond your strength, but with the testing, he will also provide the way out so that you may be able to endure it. And I think that sums up pretty well everything that we've been talking about and what the hero is supposed to go through, right? That's what stories are supposed to take us through. And that's what we as writers will go through, as well as we struggle with our own ideas and conveying our own ideas. I thought that was really cool to find that in the Bible. I'm like, well, that's it right there. That lays out the whole thing. Okay, so that's point one. Christians have a tendency to think too black and white, and you're right. I think fear-based on if you step a toe into the other side, then you're all the way in the other side, right? It's not just that you can think about these things and consider them, but you still understand the morals involved. It's like, if you travel over there, you're over there. You're with the evil people now, right? So that's the first reason. I think the second reason is that Christian film, and maybe this is true for books too. I haven't read a ton of like Christian fiction books, but Christian film fundamentally misunderstands what the conflict is. The model that we have for the Christian film genre is one that is centered around the story of salvation, or you could kind of think of it as it's the story of salvation or a battle against evil or Satan. And the reason that this does not work is because we as humans are not agents in that battle. In reality, we are not agents in that battle. We're not agents in the story of salvation either. We don't defeat evil. We can't defeat Satan. Jesus already did. That battle already played out, and we simply have to see our needs so that we can accept the salvation that Jesus bought with his blood, right? That's the whole point of Christianity. That's our whole message. We are sinners who sinned, who need to be saved. So trying to reconfigure that story in any way to make the human the hero of the story actually ruins our whole belief system. And this is the problem that like most of Christian media has been grappling with for a while now. Like since it started. It's like it's connected to the black and white idea. If the conflict is about us versus Satan or evil, then the antagonist has to be some manifestation of evil. And the writers can use that idea. Oh, it needs to be about salvation, right? They can use that as an excuse to not have to do the hard work of strongmanning their villain, or the even harder work of taking a good, honest look at yourself and seeing the darkness and the potential for sin in yourself. That's super uncomfortable to do as a Christian, I think, to look at yourself and see all the evil and sin. And it's, again, the self-righteous thing, the fear thing. We don't want to put ourselves, when you think black and white, it's a super scary thing to do, especially because if you're not all good and all white, then you belong in evil. There's only two options. And so there's the trap of thinking in that binary again. And so I think that's the conflict isn't between us and Satan. That's the wrong framing of what the true conflict of Christian media should portray. The real conflict is human nature versus growth. And if you want to make it explicitly Christian, it's growth towards good, growth towards God, growth towards morality and truth and all of those things, but it's human nature versus growth. It's not about us versus Satan. And there's a lot of verses in the Bible about Satan influencing us, about resisting Satan. I don't know if there's that many verses about us fighting Satan, because we don't. It's not that way. But I found some good verses on this as well that was really cool to read, because again, it just lays it out entirely. For I know that nothing good dwells in me, that is, in my flesh, for I have the desire to do what is right, but not the ability to carry it out. If that's not the hero's journey, what is? Like, I have a desire, I don't know how to do it, and my weakness is keeping me from doing it, right? For the desires of the flesh are against the spirit, and the desires of the spirit are against the flesh. For these are opposed to each other. Conflict, eternal conflict, always happening. They are opposed to each other. They always will be. To keep you from doing the things you want to do. To keep you from your desires. And that's, again, the hero's journey. We have a desire, but our weakness is not allowing us to get to our desire. And so the answer is we must overcome our weakness through understanding the conflict and the different models of how to live, so that we may actually achieve what we desire, or the desires of the spirit might be a way to say that as well. For you were called to freedom, brothers, only do not use your freedom as an opportunity for the flesh, but through love serve one another. For the whole law is fulfilled in one word: you shall love your neighbor as yourself. It's not about Satan, not about overcoming Satan, not about being saved. I mean, that's very important. That's core to our beliefs, as of course. But the conflict that we have is not against Satan. It's against human nature, our flesh, ourselves, our propensity to sin. And so the framing for the model that we have for Christian media is wrong. So the villain isn't supposed to be a manifestation of evil or the devil. He's a manifestation of the human nature, the desires of our flesh, our propensity to sin. If you were going to tackle a story that's about someone getting saved, then the antagonist is someone who presents the most compelling arguments for why surrendering your life to Jesus would lead to destruction. That's what the antagonist would actually stand for. That's a very different frame than what we have in the Christian film world. I want to see what y'all say. The weak villain also reveals that you personally lack the strength or wisdom to overcome the conflict they would present. Right. So for the writer, it may be a personal fear as well. Yeah. I feel like also Christian films can take on too much in their lessons. They don't focus on a single point. They try to throw the whole Bible at you. This is very helpful for me. Oh, good. Melanie. I always want to say Melanie, and I don't think that's Melanie. You have to tell me which one it is. This is very helpful for you as you figure out your Christian fantasy work in progress. So hard to balance truth, morals with entertainment and a gripping story. I don't think they're actually divorced. I think we're just trying to jam in the wrong conflict and somehow connect it and make it compelling and reconfigure, but it's just out of order. We are not the heroes in the salvation story. And so it's not about how can we be saved. It's about what is keeping us from seeing our sin. And I'm sure there are stories that tackle that, but not a lot of them. Oh, thanks, Lily. Oh, I'm glad you're on here. Hi. Yeah. A story about someone getting saved, the antagonist would be someone who presents the most compelling arguments for why surrendering your life to Jesus would lead to destruction. That is also a very uncomfortable idea for Christians. To imagine delving into that for months, building characters and building your whole conflict around that. There's a lot of fear in that. But when you frame it differently, can you imagine a character like the Joker, who instead of being anti-justice was anti-belief? Wouldn't that be fascinating? Wouldn't that be an interesting story to tell? And I think that's, instead of just another film about an anti-religious person whose life gets messed up, and then they meet a super nice Christian who helps them and leads them to the Lord. It's like the same story. We have already seen it. It's not done particularly well, and it always portrays Christians as perfect because they're supposed to be modeling Jesus. But modeling perfection is what Jesus did, but it's not what we're supposed to do. There's some more thoughts in there that I haven't completely thought out all the way, but this understanding of the conflict, I think, is how you bring the Christian message into other stories and other genres. Understand what the conflict is actually about in narrative, in the value that we are offering to our audiences. What is the conflict that offers value? And it's not one that they have no agency in. It's the one that they actually are struggling with. And so your whole story becomes a picture of our spiritual conflict with our human fleshly nature, right? That's what it's about. And you can frame that in so many different ways. You can make it physical, you can make it internal, psychological, moral. You can make it about crime, you can make it about fear, you can make it about lying, you can make it about romance. Like, it's so much more moldable because we actually have agency in it. And so I think that's probably kind of the end of my thoughts on the Christian the Christian film front. The emphasis on evangelism and salvation is not the true conflict of being a human. And so that people who haven't experienced it can't connect with it. But that's the whole point of evangelism, that you're trying to show people the experience of salvation, but they can't relate to it because it's mysterious, and it's like, maybe in art you could find a way to convey it, but if you haven't experienced it, then how can you relate it and how can you see it in the art? And so it's kind of a useless endeavor in trying to portray something to people who haven't experienced it. And it has done good. It has brought people to Jesus, but it's not illuminating the actual conflict of our lives. Wait, so it's Melanie. Melanie. Oh, I'm glad, Lily, that you can tune in here and there. This whole point is what my main theme is about in your book. Oh, cool. It's very helpful to hear this. I think that non-Christian films have historically done the best job of showing the process of overcoming your flesh, right, which shows what a universal truth that is. Right, it is the hero's journey. That's what it is. And it's about growth. It's in this book. Let me see if I can find that quote, because I think you would be interested to hear this, Lily. Oh yes, all stories are a form of communication that expresses the dramatic code. And the dramatic code embedded deep in the human psyche is an artistic description of how a person can grow or evolve. This code is also a process going on underneath every story, and the storyteller hides this process beneath particular characters and actions, but the code of growth is what the audience ultimately takes away from a good story. Right there. Isn't that cool, Lily? I mean, I don't think he's a Christian, and I don't think there are some ideas in here that I'm like, okay. But it makes so much sense from a Christian perspective what he has to say. Yeah, it makes the Christian films feel especially weird when they skip the code to growth. And they're just like, they have so many like Deus Ex Machina and come to Jesus moments where it's like, boom, you are better now. Boom, you are all good now. And it's like, okay, but how do I grow? How do I change? Because that's actually the conflict. How do I change is actually the change for the good. And that's what growth is. Change for the good, so that I can see my sin, so that I can overcome my sin, so that I may accept Jesus into my heart. How can I change and grow? That's actually the dramatic question, not how do we get saved. Paul does talk about bringing his flesh into subjection. So yes, that would be the most biblical form of conflict. Ooh, the dramatic code. I like it. I thought you would like that. So, anywho. that is my rant on Christian film. And I'm going to switch over again because I did have one more slide and I wanted to show you because I had fun with my slides. But the conflict is between human nature and God, and goodness and growth, which is God. So understanding that and reframing that for yourself might help get out of the same old that we are trapped in with the model of the Christian film industry. I'm struggling to even put the gospel in my story because the point is that all people have the propensity to be evil, not that Jesus saves. Yeah. And what I'm saying is the need to put the gospel, which, okay, I have a whole impending rant on this. I have to do a lot more research on it. If you look at the 1828 dictionary definition of gospel, it does not mean what it means today. It means the total summation of Jesus's life story and all of his teachings. And so the gospel nowadays has been boiled down to simply the story of salvation. And so when we think that, oh, the gospel is our mission, we actually have a very limited understanding. The general culture, I don't think, there's lots of individual people who don't have a limited understanding, but general culture has a limited understanding of what the gospel actually is. And so I don't know that you need to feel bad about not putting the gospel in your story, because I don't think narratively it's the story we're supposed to tell. I think storytellers are supposed to tell the story of growth. I think testimony tells the story of salvation and the personal testimony of your life, the personal testimony of the Gospels, which were personal testimonies of Jesus's life. Like, that's the purpose of those. But narrative is the purpose actually to tell the story of salvation. I am not sure. And some stories can tackle it. But I think overall the purpose is to show the code to growth, which is toward God. And so it covers so much more than just being saved. It covers virtue and character and a lot of other things. All of Jesus's teachings, principles. Now Jesus' grace and salvation gives all this power and weight, but it's like fitting too much in a story. I'd rather just share the gospel at the end of the book. Yeah. Well, thanks for hanging out with me. Oh my gosh, it's been almost 4 hours. That was a lot of fun to explore. And yeah, thanks for the idea, Megan, because I had a lot of fun digging into that and answering my own questions within that. I do have some story ideas lined up for the future that will require villains, and so it'll be very interesting to tackle those stories now having this perspective. But on that note, what do you guys want to talk about next? I'll probably do another live stream in a month or so, and I don't know, what do you want to talk about? Oh, you're welcome. Like I said, it's as much, it's probably more valuable to me than it is to you guys, because I'm actually answering my own questions. You know, there's probably questions that you have that I can't answer, you know, and then, but it's providing a lot of value to me to get this stuff worked out and to be able to express it, because that means I have to understand it if I'm going to express it. And so that's what I'm searching for understanding. Oh, you guys are very welcome. Thanks for hanging out with me and listening to me talk for 4 hours. And sticking with me through all of this and my technical difficulties. I'm going to have to get this figured out. What should I write about or talk about next, guys? One of the topics that I had put on the original poll a few months ago was, like, I don't remember how I phrased it, but I was doing research into what is an intermediate writer? What are you supposed to be doing as an intermediate writer, you know that thing where, like, you're not a beginning writer, you've written a lot of things, but you don't really feel like you've mastered writing yet, and there's a lot of things you don't understand and want to experience in before you could really say that I'm, like, a good writer and a professional writer who makes money at writing. Keep talking about it anyways, but it would be helpful to chat about how to write a good Christian fantasy story. Ooh! Actually, we could cover fantasy as a topic because, ooh, yes, this book, it made me so happy because fantasy is one of the genres that it covers, and it lent a lot of insight into fantasy and why it fails so often. And so I think I could probably do the same thing that I did here with Four Corner Opposition, where I kind of break down his explanation and thinking and formula about it, and then just look at a whole bunch of examples and explain how they did the formula or how they failed to do the formula. Also, maybe well done thriller adventure stories, like the balance between plot and theme. That one doesn't grab me as much, but I can think about that. You're right. I'd have to watch a lot more thrillers. I don't watch a lot of thrillers. I just don't watch a lot of movies, period, these days. Got too much research to do. But, okay. Fantasy as a genre sounds interesting. I'm also looking forward to your full Lord of the Rings rant. Your bit from the writer's stream got me thinking. Your whole goal is to bringing depth back into action stories. Ugh, my stupid chat has a thing in front of the bottom. Yeah, you can see it, the little heart. I'm like, I'm not sure. I have to wait till people say more to actually read what you said, Megan. Sorry. My full Lord of the Rings rant, I mean, that's the extent of what I have right now. Lord of the Rings is not a hero's journey. Yeah. I'm not sure how much more there is to say beyond what I already said. Oh, thank you. Thanks, Melanie. My whole goal is to bring depth back into action stories. Psalm into that, Mel. I think that might be a typo, or I just don't understand acronyms. I think I have a building, but I honestly think this is going to be months of research, so it's going to be a while until I bring it to you guys, but I'm building a talk about just artistry and what it is and why the Christian film, I think Christian books have also maybe done this as well, but it's more clearly seen in the Christian film industry why we just don't see a lot of artistry in the Christian film industry. It's a lot of just copy paste sort of stuff. But I think that if we could get a hold of being an artist and being creative and how that's part of the Christian life, and it's actually what God had designed for us. He's a creator, we are creators, made in his image, that would liberate a lot of creativity in Christians who tend to, again, they like their boxes and their lines, and they just kind of tend to stick with one thing. It's like, creativity, guys, like artistry, guys, maybe we should have some. And it's complex. I'm making fun and making light of it, but I'm not trying to mock people, but there's different pieces to it. So I am into that, Mel. Our understanding of the hero's journey was made by academics, not storytellers, so maybe we forgot the original point of stories as the journey that the hero goes on. So perhaps Lord of the Rings is in that vein. That's an interesting thought. I'd have to do a lot of research into Tolkien, and I found an excellent paper of his. It's quite long, so I haven't finished it, but it's about what he as a Christian believed fantasy was for, what it was. And not just necessarily the genre fantasy, because that didn't really exist as we know it today in his day, but fantasy, the idea of fantasy. Not the genre, the thing, the whimsical, imaginary. I mean, if you use the word fantasy, it's like your imagination of what you would want to be, or beauty, or creation. I don't know what the actual definition is. The original point of stories as the journey that the hero goes on. Indeed. I think there's levels, isn't there? There's like what we've been talking about, the conflict at the core. What are you trying to say about life and about the experience of being a human? There's like that level. And then there's the level that you're talking about, John, I would place somewhat above that, which is I'm imagining someone telling a story to young children, or orally, and what do we do to make that experience exciting and entertaining for them? It's like, and it's like understanding of suspense and storytelling and laying out the ideas. There's like that level that I think you're talking about, the journey that the hero goes on as part of your structure and what you are trying to communicate. And then there's like the entertainment level of the flashy bits and those are related, but maybe it's not the flashy bits. Maybe it's the tropes. That might be the level above that. Here's how it goes because this is how it goes. I don't know. I'm musing. Alright, I probably should let you guys go. Thanks for hanging with me. I will be back in a month or so with something else to say, I'm sure. If you'd like to join me for the early morning writing sessions, you can. It's 5 a.m. PST. Right here on the channel. I just hop on and I'm writing, and if somebody else is there, we're chatting. Otherwise, I'm just writing. And you're welcome to join me if you're so inclined. Melanie. Oh, how about how to trick your audience with plot twists, specifically how to manipulate the audience into thinking a certain way, then bam, flip it on his head. Hard one. I'd have to do a lot of research on that because I've never done it. That one seems more mystifying than Antagonists, honestly. But I could look into it, see what I find. It's always fun. I like research. This is fun. Thanks, Regan. Oh, yay! I'm glad you're getting writing time in. I know. It's hard with littles. But we can do it. Get things done. Alright. Well. Hope you guys have a great rest of your day. And I think it's probably late evening where you where you guys are. Right, Megan and Melanie? But I will see you next time. Bye.